Hello, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the Good Trade Summit. If you're joining us again after yesterday, welcome back. And if you're joining us today for the first time, we're very happy to have you. My name is Susanna Pak, and I'll be your MC today. So our 2-day fully virtual event combines 2 of our flagship events here at the International Trade Center. There's SheTrades Global, which is all about women's economic empowerment, and the Trade for Sustainable Development Forum, which is all about making green and sustainable trade a reality on the ground. So we had a great kickoff yesterday with more than 1,000 participants from over 80 countries, and we hope that all of you and more are joining again today. So today we'll be putting the conversations again on sustainable and inclusive value chains and trade, this time putting the accent on building forward better, as one of our speakers yesterday said. And we'll also be looking at the role of technology, including blockchain and other newer digital technologies, to make this a reality on the ground. Before we get in, we'd like to tell you that we do have more information on the idea of building back fairer and greener. There's a new op-ed published on the Project Syndicate website written by our new executive director, Ms. Pamela Koch-Hamilton. So please feel free to go check that out. And before we dive into our sessions, just some housekeeping rules. This is a virtual event, but we want to make this as interactive and fun as possible. So please be sure to make use of the Q&A function on your screen to ask the speakers questions. We just ask that you list the name of the speaker the question is for, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. And also on this platform, you'll see in the left-hand column, the People tab, which enables you to request 15-minute networking sessions, which is going on all day today, including after the summit, so be sure to check that out. We can also check out the Exhibitors tab, where we have more than 40 business people from across the world who are showcasing their products and services. So be sure to click that before you go, before the day ends. And last but not least, check out the More tab on the left-hand side. If you just want to know how this platform works, there's a short 2-minute video where you can find that out. And as always, if you are tweeting, please use the hashtag #GoodTradeSummit. We were trending yesterday, actually, so keep the conversation going. And please be sure to tag @ITC News so we can check out what you're tweeting. So we'll soon be heading into our first panel, which is on the topic of Building Back Better, Social and Economic Sustainability for Resilience. And this session will be moderated by our very own Mathieu Lamole, who is the Senior Advisor on Sustainability Standards and Value Chains here at ITC. And to help set the scene for this discussion, let's first hear from Mr. Selwyn Charles Hart, who is the Special Advisor to the Secretary General on Climate Action, and also the Assistant Secretary General for the Climate Action Team at the United Nations. We welcome your address.
Excellencies, colleagues, first let me congratulate Pamela on her appointment. The International Trade Center is definitely in good hands. Colleagues, we are living in unprecedented times. COVID-19 has shaken our health, trade, economic, and natural systems to their core. Our daily lives and jobs have been upended. Supply chains have been halted, interrupted, or entirely overhauled. Millions of people in every country and region are losing their jobs. Colleagues, this year we witnessed the most unprecedented UN General Assembly in history. It took place during the worst global crisis since the early 1900s. And it took place during the 5-year anniversary of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and just before we celebrate the 5-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement. And we are also celebrating the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. This is, across all markers, a year like no other. And as the Secretary General has said, this year we face another 1945 moment. It is in this unprecedented context in which I speak to you today about the most pressing crisis we face, climate change. I will first outline the latest climate science and then discuss the solutions before us in the form of transformational green recovery with sustainable trade policies at their core and a successful pathway to COP26 next year. Excellencies, amidst the crisis of this pandemic, climate change continues unabated. WMO recently released its United in Science report, which provides us with the latest scientific data and findings related to climate change. The key findings of the report underscore the urgency of addressing climate change. Greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere are at record levels. Emissions are returning to pre-pandemic levels following a short dip caused by the economic slowdown. The world is set to see its warmest 5 years on record, and it is not on track to keep global temperature rise to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level, a key goal of the Paris Agreement. Finally, the drivers of climate change. Emissions from fossil fuels are increasing the vulnerability of millions to COVID-19 and contributing to higher mortality rates. The pandemic is also disrupting our ability to respond to climate-related disasters, from epic floods to raging forest fires to increasingly more intense and frequent natural disasters. Colleagues, we are experiencing many firsts today as we enter a new era marked by a period of increasing climate disruption. And this brings me to where we need your support on business, economic and policy solutions, and particularly through trade and value chains. We owe it to our communities and constituents to quickly rebuild our economies after COVID-19 in a way that sets us on a new trajectory for people, planet, and prosperity. One that shifts our economic systems from green to gray and limits the increase in global temperature to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. Governments all over the world, especially in the G20, are designing and announcing unprecedented stimulus packages to shore up key economic sectors, implement social protection instruments, and save struggling businesses. And corporates and banks are re-evaluating their business models and portfolios. This is our moment, our opportunity to shift course and implement the structural and transformative changes we need. It is in this context that the Secretary General has asked all leaders, governments and private sector alike, to commit to 6 climate positive actions. First, invest in green jobs. Second, do not bail out polluting industries unless these industries are aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Third, end fossil fuel subsidies and place a price on carbon. Fourth, take climate risks into account in all financial and policy decisions. Fifth, work together, strengthen multilateralism. And fifth and finally, ensure that stimulus and recovery packages leave no one behind. The European Union's pledge to green recovery and investment, some 550 billion euros to green projects over the next 7 years, is among the largest single climate pledges in history. The EU's commitment to mainstream climate change through all policies, the Do No Harm principle and the Just Transition Fund, are particularly important milestones for climate action and can serve as models for other countries and for other regions. I applaud the EU for its leadership, and I hope that leading institutions such as the International Trade Center, young people, the business community, and civil society leaders will hold the European Union to account as it implements these commitments and embeds the Secretary General's 6 climate positive principles into all COVID recovery measures. Colleagues, we must also remember that these principles apply to all leaders. Every sector, everyone, all walks of life must also lead. Every bank, institutional investor, and fund manager must adjust their business models to lead on climate change, price in climate risks in their investment decisions, and align with the principles of the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures. Every citizen must ask for their retirements and investments to invest in environmental, social governance equities and divest from fossil fuel aligned investments. Every trade agreement, global and bilateral, should mainstream climate action and incentivize the rapid decarbonization of global value chains. Trade policy must steer investments towards renewable energy, nature, and sustainable transport. And governments must lift the many barriers corporations as small businesses face when implementing policies aligned with climate action. For instance, corporate power purchase agreements have proven to be formidable tools to drive investments in renewable energy infrastructure. Governments must explore ways to include them in trade agreements. If leveraged, they could facilitate better grid connection between countries and between regions, leading to more renewable energy production and more renewable energy exports. We also need governments to provide and finance tools needed by small and medium enterprises to scale their own transition to climate-aligned investments and purchasing decisions. Governments must send clear market signals on public procurement standards and norms, the circular economy, and carbon pricing. Corporations all over the world are seeing the writing on the wall. And the global market moving companies such as Google and Microsoft have committed to become carbon neutral or even carbon negative by 2030. We need governments and corporations to do much more and much faster, to change their supply chains, not only to reduce emissions, but also to build resilience into them, and to invest in the technological innovation we need to truly transition to low emission transport and energy system. Excellencies and colleagues, in addition to shaping green recovery plans, the UN Climate Change Conference in 2021, or COP26, is our opportunity to show the world that governments, the private sector, and civil society leaders, cities and subnational governments will step up and lead. Over the next year, we have an unprecedented chance to change course. Colleagues, we are at a critical juncture. We need all hands on deck. We need your voices to join that of the UN Secretary General in calling on governments to choose the pathway towards a green recovery from COVID-19. We have a historic window of opportunity as governments spend trillions on recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. As we respond to and recover from COVID-19, governments must hear from you about how climate action is good for business and good for trade. I count on you to use your voices, your business models, your leadership platforms to take the steps that the world urgently needs you to take. I thank you.
Very good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mathieu Lamolle, and I'm a senior advisor on sustainability standards and global value chains here at the International Trade Center. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this first panel of the second day of the Good Trade Summit 2020. Today's discussion will be focusing on one critical challenge that our world is facing. The coronavirus crisis is badly hitting our economies in the entire world, and social, environmental, economic sustainability is at stake in the way that we are rebuilding, building forward, certainly not building back just as it was before the crisis. We all want and need to build forward better. The coronavirus has far-reaching consequences on social and economic matters. For the labor force, affecting a huge quantity and quality of jobs while decimating enterprises, small and big. Hundreds of thousands of workers are currently at risk of losing their jobs, livelihoods, and this is for workers of companies of all sizes, from small and micro sizes enterprises to large corporations. All are threatened with collapse. Nevertheless, and this is why we are here today, we strongly believe here at the International Trade Center that there are ingredients, there is also a recipe, or I should probably say there are recipes for rebuilding, building forward, building in a better way than it was before COVID-19. To explain better about these ingredients and recipes, we have here several chefs on the panel today. They are very distinguished guests, and I would like to warmly welcome all of them. They are all experts They are high-level practitioners on social and economic sustainability. I want to really thank them so much for their participation on the panel today. Sharon Barrow, General Secretary at the International Trade Union Confederation. Alexandra Palt, Chief Corporate Responsibility Officer and Executive Vice President at the L'Oréal Foundation. Musadak Zulkarnain, Chairman at the Interloop Holdings Private Limited. Michelle Chocosaputro, Chief Executive Officer at the Danliris Group. Juan Esteban Orduz, President of the Colombian Coffee Federation. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm looking forward to an exciting panel discussion today. Among the key points and the questions that will be discussed, there will be the role of policies to minimize the impact of the pandemic on workers. There will be also how to create more sustainable and more resilient value chains. The role and the responsibilities of companies going beyond just the economic return and economic viability, going towards a real inclusive, social, environmental, economic sustainability. I have spoken enough. I'm delighted now to give the floor to Sharon Barrow. Sharon, thank you so much for joining today. And as I said before, you are the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, which represents over 200 million workers in over 150 countries. Social justice, women's rights, environment and labor law reforms are your daily fights. Please, let me ask you one question. How can we ensure that workers' voices are heard and integrated into national and international policies? And also, if I may ask, how can these workers' voices be heard and integrated as well as the other big challenges of today's world? I mean, climate change and environmental challenges. Sharon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and congratulations on a thoughtful conversation. If you look at our current economic model, then it's clearly broken. Before COVID-19, we already had a convergence of crises, historic levels of inequality, the climate emergency, exclusion of women and people of different races in that inequality, and then COVID-19, 500 million jobs wiped out in the formal sector, and a global employment model that is simply disintegrating, with 60% of the world's people without formal work, no minimum wages, no rule of law, no social protection. And then, of course, we've got the fact that 1.6 billion of those 2 billion people face destitution, because if they don't have daily income, that means daily work, their chances of survival are nil. So how did we get here? That's the fundamental question. And then how do we do, as you said, include all voices in the recipe for a more socially and economically just future? Well, the hyper-globalization of the 80s broke the social contract. You actually have had declining labor income share since that point, basic 30 years of a roller coaster of a lack of shared prosperity, well documented. You also saw that without the foundations in our trading system of labor rights, those supply chains you mentioned, dehumanizing exploitation in too many of them, because there's no transparency, no due diligence, no rule of law that actually allows for minimum standards. And it's the same for the environment. So for working people, we see the future as jobs, jobs, and jobs, climate-friendly jobs, because we must climate and employment-proof our future. But trade has to have a floor of global rights, workers' rights and environmental standards. And that's the answer. We also would say, in terms of question of voice, then why not social dialogue at the WTO? Why not employers and workers? And indeed, in terms of the environment, civil society itself, in terms of community voices. Because if we don't have a just transition to the future, whether it's climate or technology, and we don't have the inclusion of people's voices, then we will simply get more self-interest. So I would say to you, voice is about respect for people having a view. And just to give you comfort, I can tell you that workers are not opposed to trade. They are opposed to the current model. We all know trade is vital, particularly for a development model, but it can't be trade at any cost. And indeed, if you look at our recent global poll, then overwhelmingly, more than 2/3 of people want action on climate. Of course, they want action on jobs and social protection, and they want to know, by the way, that their digital privacy online is protected. But they also want to know that they have democratic institutions for the future that include them, that they can trust. So it's not hard. It's a matter of political will. Are we all pushing for a future that includes everybody and includes shared prosperity in a world where wealth is simply not shared? And I would be provocative enough to say, if we have to do business, if businesses can only exist on the basis of exploitation, whether it's people or the planet, then they shouldn't exist in that form.
Thank you very much, Sharon. This is not only inspiring, but this is very much pushing us all to rethink probably the business models that have been operating for so long. I would even say probably for too long. And looking forward now, there are certain fundamental principles that probably need to be more at the forefront of what will build the society of tomorrow. I thank you for those words, and I will come back to you in a moment with probably a more intricate question going into the nitty-gritty details on how can we make that work at the policy level. But in the meantime, I would like to also welcome Alexandra Palt. Alexandra, it is a pleasure to have you on the panel today. As I said also earlier, you're Chief Corporate Responsibility Officer and Executive Vice President at the L'Oréal Foundation. You're specialized in human rights. You have a vast experience. You worked in the past with Amnesty International. You have launched very ambitious, I would even say, inspiring sustainability programs at the L'Oréal. And so I would like to ask you my first question here. Social issues, environmental issues, economic issues, how are they so much connected and interrelated? And if I may ask as well, as much as those issues are connected, what is now changing with COVID-19?
Thank you very much. Well, so I have 3 to 5 minutes. So this is a question that needs probably an hour, but I'll give you I try to give very short answers because I think some of the things that I will mention are quite obvious. So first of all, what we can clearly see is that we are not going to achieve a transition to a low carbon model of our economy if at the same time we cannot guarantee inclusive models, economically inclusive models for the poorest and for all people. It's very clear, and I think this is just basic human understanding, is when you don't eat, when you do not can respond to your basic needs, you cannot think about long-term protection of a low-carbon model. So the only way to succeed this transition to a low-carbon model, which will, let us not forget it, determine the future of the human species, is to also create inclusive models and socially viable models. I very much, I have to say, I agree philosophically with what Sharon said. So I do think that a complete transformation is necessary. And it's not just necessary of companies, and I think perhaps this is where we'll differ, but because it's also necessary of individuals, of governments, of civil society actors. We all must change because we all have grew up, our education was formed on the idea of an infinite resources, infinite exploitation, infinite waste of our relationship to the living, of our relationship to everything around us. And so we all have to change. We all have to lead this transition. And I think we are living now in what COVID has shown is everybody has not understood that yet. And that is a little bit scary because COVID is one of the first, or at least in this way, the first systemic global crisis. And we see, and this is a small crisis, even if nobody feels it like that in the moment, because this is not a crisis that is killing half of those infected. This is a crisis that has quite small mortality rate, and we see what is happening to the world and to world's economy. And when you listen to climate scientists, it is very clear that this is, compared to what is coming, a small crisis, and we see the consequences. So how are we going to manage that? And I think there are some people who have understood that, and there are those who are pushing for a new model, that are the company leaders, I think, like we are, on saying, yes, we have to lead this transition to a different economy. And then we have still people who do companies, politicians, public civil servants who have not understood that yet, I think.
Thank you so much. I hear a complete transformation and a need for rethinking the way we are operating our lives. I guess this is not only for a corporate perspective, but also individual perspective. Every single one of us need to rethink the way we were operating and how lives are going on. I think you're opening up indeed a very vast conversation. It can take hours and hours of conversations. At least making those baby steps into the direction of the solutions is what we all want here. I want to thank you for those inspiring remarks, and I will also come back to you in a moment. At the moment, I would like to welcome also Juan Esteban Orduz. Muchísimas gracias por su participación en el panel hoy día. Thank you so much for joining us today. So you are president of the Colombian Coffee Federation. You're based in New York City. You have a very strong background on finance, laws, regulations, but even more, you also have a very unique understanding of the reality on the ground. I mean, the reality of coffee producers, farmers, small-scale actors that despite the fact that they are small-scale actors, they are absolutely critical and essential, and they play a very important role in global value chains. So I have one very simple question for you, although it might lead as well to a very complicated response. How can farmers and the small-scale producers be represented better in global policies? And knowing that there are so many sustainability standards and certification programs, audit protocols, codes of conduct, and especially in the coffee sector, well, can these certification programs help?
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. And just a little clarification. I'm president of the Federation for North American International Strategy. So that's why I'm based in New York and not in Colombia right now. Let me start by giving a little bit of context of what's happening in coffee. Coffee is grown by depending who you ask the question, to up to 25 million families in the world. It's one of the products that have employed more people, mostly smallholder farmers all over the world, and mostly in developing countries and the tropical belt, which is also very much sensitive to climate change. The fact that it's produced by small farmers makes it a very, very complex realities, and makes lots of things very complicated. One of the first things to note is that the coffee value chain is extremely imbalanced. In general, as a whole, the coffee value chain is positive. Everybody does, well, I mean, let me call it graphically, makes money in coffee, but the farmer who produces the coffee. In most countries, farmers cannot even cover the cost of production. Let me give you an example. In 1982, the average price of a pound of coffee was $1.30. In September 2020, we're talking 1982, September 2020, average price was $1.21. Yesterday, October 7th, it was $1.09. If we had taken 1982 prices and only brought them with US inflation, don't think of other inflation, don't think of exchange rates, and put it to today's prices, coffee should be at $3.41 at least. And it's yesterday at $1.09. What does that tell you? That the farmers have been losing their capacity to prosper and to move ahead and to have a better life, generation after generation. That's very complicated. And then we put it in a graphic way, using using coffee as a currency. In 1982, went back to that year, and we use that year because it's the year before we negotiated the last international coffee agreement with economic clauses. In 1982, if you wanted to buy a basic Jeep, which all farmers use in Colombia and many parts of, those who can afford it, you needed to produce and pay 8,200 pounds of coffee. If you want to buy the same Jeep today, you need to pay 25,959 pounds of coffee. So 3.1 times the price you had to pay 38 years ago. So it's very complicated. Not just the price is going down, but also it's very difficult for farmers to be able to cope with how things are moving ahead. What can certifications do? I think that the solution, that the work of the coffee value chain needs to be co-responsible. Everybody needs to work with co-responsibility in the value chain. Why? And what do I mean by that? Everybody is responsible for the whole chain. The roaster is responsible for the farmer is responsible to do the quality for the roaster, the trader, the NGOs, the different organizations. Organizations that certify good practices and promote good practices help. And they do, I think, a good job, very well intentioned, but always insufficient. Organizations like on which boards and some I serve in, the Reforest Alliance, they do a great job in promoting those good practices. And Nespresso, Starbucks, all those companies try to promote those good practices that will end up helping the farmer have a better income, a better life. But in a nutshell, since I know I need to be brief, the key thing is that all the players, NGOs, certification agencies, producers, roasters, traders, there needs to be a work, that a co-responsible work in defense of the value chain, and the weakest link in the chain, which is the producer. And that also includes the governments and the multilateral organizations like the International Coffee Organization. They need to work mostly focused on the producer right now. There's somebody says, a lot of people say that never let a good crisis go to waste. And this is a moment where we should not let this crisis go to waste and try to rethink some things. I don't think the pandemic is going to make us angels or anything like that, but it's a good moment to rethink some things and perhaps redo and redistribute some of the weight that we give to one or the other link inside different value chains.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Orduz. Indeed, I think those concepts of imbalances in global value chains, the concept of shared responsibility is also very important. Those issues, solutions that we need to put together are not something that will happen overnight. At the same time, it looks like there are already some existing pre-ingredients that we can reshuffle and put together. I would like to come back to you in a moment and discuss maybe a little bit deeper on those imbalances in global value chains, what has happened over this perspective you gave us over the last 20, 30 years, and see how those could potentially actually get improved in the future. At least what could we do to press the right button and go forward with a rebuilding of those value chains. Thank you for that. I would like now to move to Mr. Mossadegh Zulkarnain. I thank you so much again, and we are delighted to have you on the panel today. You're the chairman of Interloop Group in Pakistan, and you have quite an unusual profile. Indeed, you're a very highly successful entrepreneur, and you have very much the foot on the ground. I mean, practical policies, practical business policies, and you have a very clearly oriented business model towards the empowerment of the young generation and the empowerment of women. We appreciate a lot your presence on this panel, and we would love to learn more from you and from your perspective. I have one question for you. I would like to ask, from your personal experience in mainstreaming sustainability, using those fundamental principles of social and economic sustainability directly at the very core of your business model, what does it take? How does it really work? And how does it really work, especially operating in a sector like yours? I mean, the textile sector is probably one of the most labor-intensive industry in the world. And this is unfortunately also a sector that is well known for cases of severe violations of human rights and social injustice. So it must be very hard to keep up doing with a business built on the very much principles of social and economic sustainability. So we'd love to hear from you how you managed to do this and how you could actually inspire others to do the same.
Thank you, Matthew, for having me on this panel, and it's very interesting. I would start with what I think Sharon said in the beginning, that the system is broken, and it's broken for quite some long time now. COVID-19 has only exposed the ugliness of this broken system, and has probably asked us to look more efficiently and more quickly towards the broken system. As you said, I think first of all, for all the consumers and for everybody else, the word sustainability is confusing. Most of the, because I think in a market economy, what we ignore is the consumer really can control the whole system. And if the consumer doesn't understand what does sustainability mean, then I think we have a big problem. So when we talk of sustainability, the consumer thinks it's about the planet, it's about having the natural ingredients, and you see things like those. They don't look at the other aspects. For us in our company and many other companies, sustainability is the triple bottom line. It has to look for the planet's sustainability. It has to look for the people, for the people's well-being. It has to look for the prosperity, not only for the shareholders, but also for the community, for the people who work for it, the people who buy your products. So what I think is that once it's the greed for money, to be honest, in the present system, which has, you see, we will have, it's a long struggle. It's not going to end, but I think we have to try. It is the shareholder prosperity which has driven the company's visions, company's missions. They just want to, most of the companies in the world, they just want to make money. And if that is the aim, I think then it will be just a window dressing here and there to address the issues. Unless the corporates and the shareholders of the corporates start believing in the triple bottom line, in the stakeholder prosperity rather than just the shareholder prosperity, things will not change. Now, coming, you see, in our company, what we decided was that we will have a triple bottom line sustainability, and we will expand our business only if it's ethical and it's sustainable in that manner, and we will work for the prosperity of the people who work for us, the communities in which we work, our suppliers, our buyers, the consumers. And I think it appears that you can't make money because of that if you do all this. I think it's not true. If you start taking care of your workers, if you start taking care of the people who work for you, give them a little share of the prosperity, they give you extra, much more than what they're supposed to do. And I think the overall acceptability in the community, that brings the prosperity. So I think any certifications, any other things will make things a little better. But I think we have to convince the manufacturers, we have to, the triple bottom line sustainability is initially going to cost them more, but in the longer run, that is what is needed. I think we also need to, maybe we'll discuss that later, we need to convince the consumers that they should insist on the triple bottom line sustainability, not just the planet sustainability. Not that the product is made with a organic cotton or with a recycled product. It's who has made it. Is there food on the table of that person who has made it? It is not just the manufacturers and the workers. I think it is the retailers, the brands, the consumers, which will move. The retailer will move to a low wage country, or to a country where the minimum wage is below the living wage, and they leave the manufacturers who are ready to give the right wages. So I think it has to be a collective action, starting from the consumer. The governments have to play a role, the associations have to play a role, the trade unions have to play a role. We all have to play a role. And I think from my personal experience, it is the corporates don't suffer if they want to follow the triple bottom line sustainability. So this is what I can say at this stage. We can continue discussing this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Musadak. I'm hearing a holistic approach. I'm hearing consumers that need to be better aware of those practices, triple bottom line approach, as you say, that this is not just about one thing, it's about the whole thing. Those are very interesting, of course, concepts. The question would be rather how to implement that at the company level when there are some obstacles, of course, obstacles such as this consumer awareness or lack thereof and other issues that may arise. We'll come back to that in a moment. Thank you again for your words. Michelle Chopra-Saputro, I thank you also very much for joining the panel today. Last but not least, you are our last panelist for this session. You are CEO of Danliris Group and you're based in Indonesia. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We also hear your commitment to women empowerment, support to the young generation. This is well known and this is much appreciated. And my question to you is very similar to what I asked to Musadak earlier. I'd like to learn from your business experience and personal commitment at your company level, how possibly can you boost up and improve the social sustainability within the DNA of your company? I mean, was it an easy process? And most importantly, how did you communicate with your stakeholders? I mean, your direct suppliers and your clients. Can you share some thoughts with us about this?
Yeah, so I think it has to start from me. I think it has to start, from the top level where I should genuinely show my care about the people, the environment, the country, that just basically the people that I work with. So I think it struck me sometimes that, we work, for so long in a certain area, but we actually don't do anything to our surroundings. Even sometimes we see, like, probably when you hear about Indonesia, you hear so much about demonstrations, strikes, and all that. But it's also, I think it's because a lot of companies forget that they also should relate to their, the people, to communicate, to have the relationship, not just, like employer and employees. So I think from the start, I started, doing this job because my father passed away so soon. So I realized that I won't be able to succeed without my people in my company. So from then on, I really stresses how much, just working together, that I'm there actually to serve my people there, not they serve me. So I'm there, to help them with all the, just not only just giving directions, but also to support my people. And it started from little things like, just to make sure that when they just give birth, they have a space where they can breast milk, for example, where they can pump, just little things like, sometimes they need, a certain time arrangements when they just have babies or just couples who work in the company. So I just started to do all those little things because I care. So not so much on, the rules, the regulations, but I just want to make sure that they know that, my company is their second home, because absolutely, like, literally, in reality, they work in us like 8 to 10 hours a day, and so it's probably almost half of the day they spend with us. So I just want to make sure that they're comfortable with. And I believe if they have, a good balance at home and at work, they can, especially for women, because, we have more women workers in the garment, especially. So I believe that, if men and women have, a really good balance in life, they can focus better at, in my company, less criminality, like less, less drama. So when I start to care about them and they know I care, literally we have less problems. We have more initiatives, more loyalty. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Michelle. This is good. It looks like it's good working in your company. I'm sure many workers must envy yours, or at least will be happy to work with you. I'll come back to you with that in a moment. What I propose now is that I'll just pick every one of you, your brain on one particular point that you mentioned. I'll just go again in the order of the presentations, one after the other, and then we have more of a group conversation. The one thing I wanted to come back to you, Sharon, was about what you mentioned about the system is broken. You mentioned that more from a provocative way, if business is only based on exploitation, there should be no business. And we hear that, and I think all support it as well. I wanted to pick your brain on what you said about the democratic processes, and especially in the view of having everyone represented in those global consultations to build forward something new, something better, a system that would not be broken. So democratic processes have been on the highlights of so many newspapers today in different contexts. What would be your views on how that can be fixed? I mean, is there anything that is already kind of taking shape, or is this something that you would like more as a wish, but unfortunately is not yet happening?
Well, first of all, let me say to the other panelists, great comments, but Musadak in particular, we've missed your voice on the global stage. It's surprising to see a global trade union leader and a Pakistani business and employer leader speak the same language, but we do. And there are also courageous entrepreneurs, manufacturers from India, like the Dalmia country, making the transition in a green economy to circular production, but including their membership. And I know, L'Oreal, you are making strides on due diligence and the transparency. I would also just say on the coffee piece, coffee has grown exponentially in demand. Somebody's making money. It's not the farmers and it's not the workers in the production supply chain. Someone is making massive money. We know who it is. So if you take Musadak's recipe, let's look at the shared prosperity for everybody, and then we all benefit. Frankly, I don't want climate to destroy coffee. It's one of my favorite enjoyments in the day. So it comes back to the voice question. If we have social dialogue, then we have common interests. There's no doubt that, yes, there are some global monopolies in business, the big tech companies, some of the bigger corporations, but there are magnificent voices also. Paul Polman is one of the men I admire most. He was tweeting today that, we need to fix the system, and we do. So how do we do that? That's your question. Well, in terms of social dialogue, it's an established process at the ILO. Why? Because out of 2 world wars and a Great Depression, we had visionary leaders who came together with labor, who then invited employers, by the way, into the ranks to build a global rule of law that gave a social base that enabled workers to feel like they would have opportunity and security in a world of renewing the economy. We had a social contract that worked, as I said, until hyperglobalization of the 80s. And what hyperglobalization did, it actually allowed for the oligopsonies, global monopoly power, whatever you want to put on it, to actually price out a business, the small manufacturers, and in turn to exploit the workers. Because if you keep pushing down the price, as you heard very clearly in the coffee story of the contract every year, and then you can't pay your workers a living wage, or the people in the production chain are not paid a living wage, and there's no respect for freedom of association and collective voice, then you have exploitation. It's that simple. From modern slavery right through to oppression and attacks on workers and their unions. So we need a different world. We need a world where we all care about the economy that will support the community, because it's also got to be an economy that not only builds communities, but it actually is respectful of the planetary boundaries of our environment. Otherwise, we are all doomed, whether you're wealthy, whether you're not wealthy. We're in a potential moment of pushing towards our own extinction. So climate-friendly jobs are critical, living wages are critical, and indeed social protection. If I told you that, 55% of the world's people have no social protection, none, not anything, not a dollar of resilience to depend on. And then when you have 75% of the world's people who actually have little or no social protection, so again, no resilience, we have no foundation to meet global shocks. And they're coming again. Extreme weather events, daily we see reports, more global health challenges, no doubt about that, particularly as we break down boundaries and people don't have access to health services because we've underfunded health and education and other vital services that business depend on as well as workers. So we can only repair this world together. And it has to have a foundation of fair competition, respectful approaches to rights and freedom of association and voice, and of course, environmental standards. If we start from that floor and we're all trying to build our communities and look after our families in a fair share, and I thought Musadaq said it absolutely correctly, if we don't move from a shareholder first model to a stakeholder model, but the stakeholders have to be broad. They can't just be, you know, the business community. It has to be the community itself. It has to be workers, of course, and we will then build a future we can trust. But it is about inclusion because we've taken the responsibility collectively to say, how do we sustain business? And I've worked a lot through this COVID crisis with business to try and look to sustainability, to try and bring business, government support into the mix. We're fighting now for a global social protection fund that would underpin the self-employed as well as workers. But I can tell you that even I was shocked to see major brands don't have 3 months of resilience, 3 months of operating expenses in their accounts. We saw that with the banks in 9/10. We can do better than this, but it will take all of us being committed to a shared set of values.
Thank you so much, Sharon. An economy that supports the community. You mentioned there are very courageous entrepreneurs. I would even add there are very courageous institutions like yours. I feel even more thrilled now. I mean, after hearing all of you and what you have to say, that yes, we do have the ingredients to build forward and to build a better world. It's just a matter of actually making those ingredients and tools at the hand of those that have actually the power of changing things. Thank you again for your kind words. Alexandra, I would like to turn back to you again now. I mean, you mentioned something according as well the same lines, inclusive models that are needed and a complete transformation of the way businesses were operating before. And you have already started the pathway in that at the L'Oréal. Congratulations. You mentioned also one thing, which is when you don't have access to the basic needs, I'm talking about people losing their jobs and their livelihoods. When you do have those basic needs that are at stake, it's very hard to have a medium-term or long-term perspective. What you need is just today, you need to eat, you need to bring your children to school, you need to actually fulfill those basic needs. So that creates a big obstacle in actually creating a long-term vision for a business to transform, to improve, to embrace sustainability, whereas the only nitty-gritty detail that you need now in the short term would be money. So how do you reconcile the crisis situation where those basic needs are at stake with actually a long-term vision? How can that work together?
So I think I'll speak for companies, you know, because I do not want to speak because you put it down to a very personal level, individual level, and I think it would be very arrogant to have an idea of how a woman with 3 children somewhere in any place in the world is trying to survive every day and to give any lesson because she deserves already all our admiration and respect. So I'm talking for how a company can do so. And I think what is our role as a company is, and I think actually the crisis for kind of some visionary people is a very, very obvious sign of what is happening if we don't do it. And unfortunately, there is still a lot of people asking the question the wrong way. They say, oh, how much is this going to cost? And the right question to ask is, how much is it going to cost if we don't do it? And so I think there is something which is very clear for us, at least, that companies can only thrive in a society that is thriving. You cannot succeed when there is chaos, poverty, war, destruction around you. So there is no other perspective. And so for us, and then you might say, once again, it's easy to speak from our place because beauty is a very resilient sector. We have a very good, we are in a very, very healthy and comfortable situation. But I think we are in a situation also because we're always aware of long-term issues, because we are lucky to we can do so because we have still family. And I think this is a very interesting issue also, about that it's not just short-term shareholder satisfaction, 6 months or a year, but on a long-term perspective. So we very early understand the opportunities, needs, and how we have to adapt to the society, I think. And we have done this even more through COVID. So we were able to support our suppliers quite a lot. So we started during the COVID crisis, we had 1,200 WhatsApp conversation with our suppliers all around the world to identify their needs, to pay immediately, because normally you have delays. In order to help them on treasury issues, we paid immediately more than 10,000 suppliers in order to allow them to have available money. In the WhatsApp talk, we identified needs in hand sanitizers that we delivered to them, but also on business issues, some mentoring, help in taking the right decisions from our perspectives. We are doing this also because since 2 years or 3 years, we think of our company as an extended company. So we are operating the shifts on digital and sustainable with our suppliers. We bring them with learning expeditions to our company so that they can see how we function, what we need, how we can cooperate, how we can share. There are training platforms that are called My Campus for suppliers, so that suppliers can train themselves on sustainability issues, on digital transformation issues. So all this in order to help our suppliers to thrive too. We are also doing this, of course, for all our natural ingredients, raw materials coming from different places in various countries. We always work with suppliers, local communities, NGOs on the ground. So I think that is what we did for the supplier. We did a lot for local communities, for clients, of course, but that goes by itself, for our employees. And so I think that is an expression of how we think our role in the society, of who we think we want to be, who we are. And in crisis, it's always like you see the best and the worst. And I have to admit that I was quite proud of our company, because I think we tried at least to show the best.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. And indeed, I mean, what would happen if we do nothing? This is certainly not an option. We appreciate a lot your work and examples of collaborations with the suppliers. That also relates to something that other panelists mentioned about the shared responsibility, the collaborative effort, the multi-stakeholder approach. And this is what actually brings me now back to you, Juan Esteban. I would like to ask you, the coffee sector is, of course, very, very specific. I mean, there are good cases in analysis on the cocoa sector as well, with actually similar and sometimes different types of challenges. My question would be rather focusing on this shared responsibility and multi-stakeholder approaches. Growing coffee in South America, in Africa, or in Vietnam. I mean, it's a totally different context. And sometimes, as Sharon mentioned also earlier, although we love coffee and this is a beverage that we need every day, if you look at really how that works for the farmers, it is quite a catastrophe. And some big people make big money, and it's certainly not the farmers. So my question is, how can we improve those supposedly multi-stakeholder processes or broken processes claiming multi-stakeholder empowerment when this is not the case? How can we make that better? how can we ensure that there are the appropriate institutions that support the voices of the farmers and their livelihoods in a global trading system that supposedly at the moment only benefits very few people?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think I'm going to need until in the next 2 hours to answer that. So let me try to give you an answer. On one hand, the coffee trade system is a very complicated and very unfair system because coffee is produced mostly by smallholders, as I said before, all over the world, tropical belt. But at the same time, coffee is traded based on a contract that's in the New York Commodities Exchange. It does not really reflect the cost of producing the coffee and does not really reflect necessarily the physical trade of coffee. There's a lot of speculation, lots of interference in the futures contract, which is the one that gives you the price of coffee. On the other hand, you have some in the value chain that will say, you know, it is what it is. I mean, the price of coffee is what the exchange tells you, and that's what I'm willing to pay. I want to go back to something that Alexandra mentioned and something that Musadak mentioned as well, which is, of course, the role of every enterprise is to make money. In terms, if you're a coffee farmer, if you're a 1 hectare coffee farmer, you are basically a small enterprise. You are part of the private sector. If you are a big company, you want to make money too. That's okay. But at the same time, in every step of the way, you have suppliers, and I'm thinking especially if you are that's why coffee and cocoa may work a little bit in the same direction in some places. You are not dealing with a company that produces your bottles or produces a certain raw material or something. You're dealing with millions of small farmers that have no leverage to have in most countries to have a eye-to-eye discussion with the industry or with the trade. So it's very difficult. It's very easy to let things be the way they are. It's very difficult for farmers. It's very easy to do that. Very difficult for farmers to have their voices heard. That's why I think that something that Sharon mentioned is you need to work together. On one hand, the different segments. I'm thinking the producers, they need to work together, they need to gather, and they need to have their voices heard. But they also need to go not just to the middle of the chain, but also to the end of the chain on the other side. And you need to let consumers know what the real situation of the coffee value chain is. If consumers know, that's much more easier said than done. What happens in the value chain? What happens with the farmers? How farmers cannot cope, cannot even make a decent living. In some places, many consumers will say, okay, let's look at this, and they will put some pressure on the other links of the value chain. And I'm going to build on something that Musadak mentioned, which is the shareholders' prosperity. Everybody wants to prosper. It's not just a matter of making a living, it's a matter of prospering. Everybody wants to have their children be better off. We want our children to be better off than ourselves, and we want our grandchildren to be better off than our children. And this is something that farmers cannot even aspire to, because we only start about talking about economic sustainability in 2015, 2016, the value chain, because of the pressure of producers that got together in Colombia and then in Brazil in something called the World Coffee Producers Forum and started to put pressure on the value chain. And that's when everybody started to talk about economic sustainability of farmers. But then you start moving this into a concept, which is the living income. So we need to secure the farmers have a living income. That is, in the opinion of many of the producers and players, is on the producing side. It's unambitious. It falls short. It's even discriminatory, and that's because. And I'm totally pro-business. I think everybody should be making money, but when I say everybody, the farmers should be making money at the same time as the roaster, the trader, the retailer, and the consumer should have a good coffee in the cup. It's insufficient because the definition of living income is that you have a decent income that covers your basic needs and a little extra for unforeseen events and save a little bit. This is not what we're looking for. If you were talking about German farmers or American farmers, would this definition be acceptable? Of course not. They don't want to just make a living. They want to prosper. They want to be better off every year and every generation afterwards. So we need to not just work on a co-responsible way, but we need to even change the language and start talking about farmers' prosperity income. We need the farmers to prosper, not to live. They should be, of course, have a decent income, but it's not about decent income. No one in the developed world wants to have a decent income. They want to prosper. So why is it that we talk about living income for the farmers and prosperity for the shareholders? We should be talking about prosperity for the farmers too. And this is something we've been working on in Colombia and at the global level with the Producer Forum, which is we need to move into farmers' prosperity income. This is not not that difficult, but starting with the language, we're falling short in bringing the farmers to a better place.
Thank you so much, Juan Esteban. I think this is raising several times the topic that I will turn back to Musadaq in a moment about this shareholders' prosperity. One thing as well, you mentioned about the consumers knowing or that need to know. And it's true that when we as simply as grab a coffee in the morning, do we really know where the coffee is coming from? Do we really know what sustainability attributes it may have? That's not necessarily the case. Some consumers do know or do care, some others don't. It is a co-responsibility effort. You mentioned co-responsibility at different times. And I think indeed it's not just into the hands of the corporations and the companies and the traders, but also any stakeholder that's involved. It's very much in terms of to which extent can the stakeholders have a say and make things happen in a different way that will be really a coping of those imbalances in global value chains. Thank you for your very rich experience again and sharing that with us. I'll turn back to Musadaq about this concept. You mentioned shareholders, prosperity. You mentioned also this concept of making consumers more aware about what the whole sustainability may mean, a confusing concept, as you mentioned, and indeed sustainability is become so much of a buzzword that everyone uses it in every possible way, and that, of course, denatures the very value and meaning of sustainability. So how can we fix that? How can we ensure shareholders' prosperity? I mean, if we look at typical textile value chain and the different actors that integrate into such a chain, again, the money is not shared evenly across every segment of the chain. So when we discuss about shareholders' prosperity, from your personal experience, how does that work? And how can we ensure that the different stakeholders involved, business stakeholders and non-business stakeholders, have actually their power in making things better?
Thank you once again, Matthew. I think, first of all, thank you, Sharon, for the kind words. And what I said, Matthew, was that we have to look for the stakeholder prosperity rather than the shareholder. Shareholder prosperity, we have always been, the world has been looking for the shareholder prosperity. And I completely agree and endorse what Sharon said, that the stakeholders have to have a wider meaning, much wider than we might think. Coming back to your question, I think it is going to be, again, a collective effort. We need to, and the good thing is that with this digitization of the world, the information can be spread very, very easily. But to give you an example, for example, that probably the consumer doesn't understand what's happening. I'll give you just through an example. I'll try to, demonstrate what's going on. And as Sharon said, to see and find out who is making the money. Where's all that money going? Considering the textiles, the apparel, let the first cost, the FOB cost of any garment or any apparel piece is maximum 20 to 25% of the retail price. So if a garment leaves a factory at $2, the consumer is paying anywhere between $6 to $10 to buy that garment. So let's assume it's $8. And on average, the wages of the first price is maybe 15%. So the person or the persons who have made that garment gets just 30 cents of the $8 spent by the consumer. And after the raw material has been put in, the energy has been put in, the labor has been put in, there is $6 which is going somewhere. I'm not saying that the retailers or the brands are making all that money, but that 75% of that price is going somewhere. If we can educate the consumer, you see when you go to the marketplace, you see markdowns of 25 to 50% on the garments, on the apparel, or anything. So in order to, you see, grab the customers, grab the footfall in your shops, in your markets, the prices are reduced by 25 to 30%. But if it's the question of paying 1% more on the price or 1% out of the price, which will probably increase the wage of the person who's made it by 30 to 40%, nobody's willing. Sharon mentioned something very interesting, that they are working on a global social protection fund. I think that's a brilliant idea. It needs to be supported by the governments, by EU, by US, by everybody. Why can't we put a, let's say, 2% mandatory charge on everything which sells and put it in that fund? And then you can always have some voluntary contributions there. And that fund can be used not only on the well-being and social protection of the labor force, it can also form of a reserve fund in situations like this COVID. As Sharon said, that there were retailers who didn't have enough money to pay wages for 2 to 3. The similar situation is for a manufacturer, if they are making 3% to 4% on their sales, it's very difficult to retain the labor for so long. But what fault is there of that of a worker who has had no meals on the table for his family when COVID hit? Somebody has to sustain that. We have to share that. So I think we need to come up with ideas through the trade unions, through the governments, through regulation. I think it is important, it is imperative that we not only look after the social well-being of the countries where the consumers are, but also where the things are being made, where the coffee is being grown, the farmer, even for the cotton farm, the workers. We have to create those funds. The United Nations probably has to play a role. The ILO has to play a role, and the governments have to play a role and provide that social safety net for the people who don't have anything, whether they are farmers, whether they are workers. And I think the manufacturers, they do have a responsibility, obviously a responsibility, to share that prosperity and to, make sure that the people who work day and night, their children have health care, they have pension plans, they have some extra to save, as it was put in for bad times. So I think it can only come through a collective understanding and collective realization that we have to do it. Otherwise, as very rightly said, I think it's not the question of how much it will cost. It's the question of how much it will cost. We don't provide that safety net. All the troubles going on between the haves and have-nots in the world today, it's a clash of civilizations. I would say there's a civilization of haves and there's a civilization of have-nots, and it's going to get worse. And we will keep blaming it on various things. It's actually the question of people having enough money to have some prosperity, some share of prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A collective effort, shared sense of values, that will help moving forward. Collective effort is not so easy. There might be some values and some very high level goodwill in a company, in a government, in a subset of the value chain that does not necessarily translate into a transformation of an industry, a transformation of the world. I heard from the previous also panelists, there is a complete transformation that is needed, a system that is broken. So I would like to highlight on this collective effort that you're mentioning, Musadak, and turn it now to Michelle and ask Michelle, this collective effort, we heard from you how pleasant it seems to be working in your company, feeling part of a family, feeling part of something where the trust then is coming from the top, from the CEO, from yourself, ensuring the workers share the values, they feel at home, it's their second home. All of that sounds great because it enables you indeed to have motivated workers and to achieve your goals, not just the company goals, but also the goals of society a bit larger, definitely. So my question is then, if we move beyond the boundaries of your company and we look at your clients and we look at your suppliers, how do you ensure that there is an alignment of the values, that the suppliers understand what you actually require, the highest values that you have at your company, and how do you use the values in communicating with your clients? So looking up and down to your suppliers and clients, how easy is it to communicate about your values? What are the obstacles? What works? What doesn't work?
Yeah, I think it's harder to communicate with, surprisingly, to our clients because I think they expect, in reality, they just expect good price, good quality, good lead time. And then, even though they have all these audits, I feel it's just an accessory, just to justify that they do it sustainably, that they check, that they just do the audits. So usually, during the buyer meetings, when I attend, I always show our values. When we have our buyers coming into the list, we show that if you expect, my company to give you at the lowest price, I think you go to the wrong direction. You go to the wrong place. I said straight to them, please don't expect, you get the cheapest price. You can probably find it in other parts of the world, but just not, in my company. But I assure you that I treat my peoples right. That I assure you can ask my people that they love to be here, that they are treated fairly and they are treated humanly. And that's the most important thing. And so some work, some don't, but for me, I think it's just my personal belief and of course the management belief that we only live here once and we just have to do, we just have to have the integrity to do it, we might not be the biggest company, the biggest manufacturers in Indonesia or in the world, but at least we can justify our actions in front of our people and our environment. And with our suppliers, we actually initiate working with them, collaborate with them. For example, what we do, we started to recycle our cotton waste, and then we send them to our hand weave. Indonesians have their lurik and their batik hand weave artisans. So we start to, ask them, can you try? Or we ask them to dye their fabrics or yarns in our factory, so we can, process the waste. Process the waste if the dye is not, eco. And then we also work with our suppliers like plastic, the boxes, the packaging. We ask them, how can we recycle and how can we do that? And while also paying them, with a good amount of money. So usually what we do, we sell them our recycle yarn cheaper than what they usually buy. And then we buy their products more than, other people buy from them. And then we sell them through our stores. So we've been doing that for a few years. And, these artisans are usually elderly people that, sometimes they are not, taken care of, and they don't have, stable jobs. That's what they do for their life. So yeah, we've been working a lot with disabilities and the elderly people, just to ensure that we can grow together, and we pay them with, not just by piece, but ensuring that it's as the living wage. Yeah, so that's just something that we do.
This is great. I love these interactions and these conversations we have. I mean, would you have nothing else in the day, I would keep you here for 5 more hours on the debate and discussion. Really, thank you so much for all your fantastic remarks. We've had a kind of an intense group discussion as well on the chat box. We have received several questions from the participants that are listening to you. I had the privilege of asking all of you several questions, and you also echoing each other in your remarks. I think it's fair to give the floor as well to the audience. We have a few questions. I will just summarize them and just give you maybe not word by word everything that was written in the chat box, but highlight some of these questions that were. One is about, and maybe I'll ask you, Sharon, to think about it. One person said the speed of help is very important in the pandemic, the speed of reactions, although this is not very simple, of course, to react quickly, especially for the workers that are about to lose their jobs, or they have very precarious contracts. So how can we improve the alarm system in the global trade? How can we improve reactivity in future shocks? In other means, how can we build resilience when it comes to safety of the workers?
So in the developed economies, you saw the unions go to work, and you saw job protection, business continuity to ensure job protection, health access strengthened, and income guaranteed through wages or other basic income, with improved social protection measures. There were a massive amount of shifts in government approaches, and they were reasonably fast. In the developing economy, we see what you've described. Tragically, while we worked with the garment manufacturers, it took a long time to get support into the countries and the workers. And even then, many workers were excluded because a lot of the factories had closed down. And it comes back to that business resilience. You know, in 2008-9, we were all shocked to see the banks had no equity base. And even though it wasn't popular with the banks at the time, the financial regulations shifted that and required banks to contain more equity as a resilience factor. That's actually kept a lot of the banks alive and available to people during the course of this crisis. We didn't see that with major businesses who were letting contracts to supply chain. So we saw many of them unable to even pay for the orders they'd let alone to give the business confidence of future orders, even if it was delayed by a few months. And again, without that universal social protection, then businesses don't have that support either. They can't look to sustain themselves as manufacturers without money, and their workers at the same time. Now, of course, there were, very cruel edges of this where business community could have done more. But in the main, it was really the model that you see again was broken. So I'm really grateful to Mossadegh for supporting the concept of a global protection fund. You could build it up in layers. There's no doubt about that. Direct donors, of course, from the developed countries. The debt relief there should be no conditionality on debt relief except investment in their own people and development. So the SDGs as a lens. And social protection is indeed 1.3 is the indicator. And then you actually could look at where the special drawing rights that the managing director of the IMF is championing along with debt relief, where rich countries could provide liquidity swaps into the developing economies, and again, tag part of that. And then there's a shocking story of ODA. it isn't the amount of ODA. We can always argue it should be increased, but the OECD figures show that of the OECD countries, only 0.4% of ODA is actually going to social protection. Now, we know that if social protection systems are in place, starting with health and income support, for 5 years, you build a system that is then increasingly sustainable. So the level of support tapers off. That's worth having. That's worth us all investing in for the sake of humanity and also for the sake of resilience that might keep many more of our businesses and workers afloat.
Thank you so much. This is very good and very helpful. We had another question, was more from a consumer's perspective then, switching a little bit the perspective here. And it's a consolidation of different feedback and comments we had in the chat box, but it looks like investing in ethics and sustainability is not at no cost for big companies like L'Oreal and textile sector is the same. So when we have those higher costs of production ensuring sustainability, and there is the living wage, and there is all this protection for the workers, and there is also preservation of the environment, that may actually result in a higher price on the final product, and so consumers may be less reluctant to actually pay more for the products. So unfortunately, Alexandra had a very urgent call and she had to leave us. We totally excuse her for this. I would like to maybe ask if Musadak would have some points to say on this, or Sharon, of course, please feel free to also say a few words on this. The question being that with a crisis that is hitting not only the businesses, but also individual people, the possibility of paying sometimes a little bit more for products that are more ethical or sustainable is a challenge for some people. So how would you see that?
Musadak will have wise words from a business perspective. Can I just say a lot of this is myth? It's just myth. Yes, I'm not going to deny that you would have to pay, you know, maybe $2 or $3 more on a t-shirt for a living wage, or $2 or $3 more on basic food that week. In fact, it comes down to 30 cents on a melon to give living wages to the workers who are exploited in Honduras. I've walked those fields, many of the supply chains. But I can tell you what a minimum living wage by our calculation, and it's not even a prosperous wage, but it would allow workers and their families to survive. In Asia, in the poorest countries, we've begged ASEAN, and we do have a dialogue with them, let me acknowledge, next week, or the week after, but we've begged them now for nearly 2 years to actually champion a minimum wage floor in Asia. So fair competition is maintained. And you know what it will cost? For the biggest companies, $50 a month would guarantee those workers a living wage with dignity. It's not in some of the wealthier countries, but in the poorest supply chain companies. You know what that is from the profit take of a Samsung or pick another big company. It's actually, yeah, you do the maths, it's about $500 or $600. But if I told you every worker in that supply chain earns that company profit of $1,600, and if a lot of that would go back in a multiplier impact, then let's get rid of this myth. Let's say, as Musadak said it better than anyone, let's share our prosperity.
I love it. We can do this. Musadak, can you also share your views on this?
I think I completely agree with Sharon. I think it appears that you will have to, since she mentioned the t-shirt, you'll have to pay $2 more, $3 more to let the workers have a living wage. No. I think even if they pay 10 to 15 cents more, the amount of t-shirts which a worker makes, it can still help. The question is, I think I'll go back. Why should the brands and retailers be buying or manufacturing products in places where there's no social safety net? The differentiation between it should not be that you have to pay more. It is the question of are you manipulating the workers or not? And from the profitability point of view, but keeping just the textile chain in mind, I can create more efficiencies. My people who work for our company, they can create more efficiencies if we get, let's say, more orders, if we have more quantities. So if all the consumers and the retailers and the brands, they just start buying from responsible manufacturers, the sheer increase in quantity will ensure that while transferring the benefits to the workers, there's no increase in price. There's actually no increase in price just to give more wages, because you're getting more orders, because you are a responsible manufacturer and you're working with a responsible retailer who is selling to a responsible consumer. So I think it is workable. It's nothing which is impossible. It's just the question of communicating right and doing the right thing.
Thank you so much. This is very wise indeed, and I'm only hearing one thing: we can do this, and it is possible. It is not out of reach to fix the problem. Juan Esteban, we had another series of questions in the chat box that were primarily about helping SMEs, and most probably the most vulnerable and small scale producers and the farmers. The coffee examples you gave were great. The question in the chat is primarily, how can we help them better if there is another shock coming up? What are the mechanisms to really help better the farmers in the future than they were in the current crisis?
Thank you very much. Let me tell you something. There's no other shock coming for coffee growers, because we are not out of the shock that was before the pandemic. So we're in the same place, or perhaps a little worse. But the problem is a structural problem. I think that the first thing to keep in mind, the first thing we need to do is to have a coordinated efforts along the value chain to work on those and try to ensure the sustainability of the whole chain. Let me give you like two things, because something that Sharon mentioned was made me think of something. We did 2 years ago. We made a study with Professor Jeffrey Sachs about sustainability of the coffee value chain, especially the smallholders. And that's something was done by the World Coffee Producers Forum with Columbia University, the team led by Professor Sachs. And he came to very interesting conclusions. One is that there should be a global coffee fund to support investment in farmers and in farming, from climate change to all the needs, and to make sure that they are more sustainable than they are right now. But there's also a very interesting point, which is where I want to focus. Is he suggests or the team and we were part of this whole work, that there should be, producing countries should make what we call national coffee sustainability plans, because it's a whole discussion between producers and traders and the industry and so on, and the governments of producing countries. But lots of the things that affect coffee growers, and one has to be fair on that, don't come just from the industry paying low prices. They also come from not having sufficient support from the governments. Maybe because they consider coffee that important, they don't consider it important, or maybe in many cases because they just don't have the resources. Remember, coffee is produced in developing countries. It's not produced in developed countries. So it's very difficult. But we need to have a coordinated effort, not just the let's say the traditional chain, the production chain from the farmer to the consumer. You need to have the governments involved. You need to have the let me call it the civil society, for lack of a better word, that includes consumers, and you have to have the NGOs and people who work on sustainability matters, not just and climate change, not just work together to ensure the sustainability of the coffee chain, but also to actually do their best effort in whatever it is that they do in making sure that farmers can prosper and be better off. So to answer your question is, what can we do? I think the first thing we need to do is to have a clear concept that we are all co-responsible of the value chain, and we are all and we need to work together in making it happen. It's good business. It's not utopia. It is good business to make the coffee value chain work properly. And Alexandra's point to how much it's going to cost us, Maybe lots. How much is it going to cost us if we don't do it? I'm sure much more than what it could cost us if we do it, if we support the farmers.
Yes. And thank you so much, Juan Esteban. This is great. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. I must say we had excellent contributions from all the panelists. I really warmly thank you for your contributions today. It's been a fantastic panel. I will rewatch it several times. Just exciting discussions. Thanks for all the learnings. My colleague will mention to you in a moment two fantastic publications that ITC has just released today, publications around the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and linking voluntary sustainability standards, extremely at the core of what a global framework can bring, and sustainability standards and movements towards sustainability in global value chains. That is the first publication. And the second one on the state of sustainable markets, showing by proof and the evidence how the markets are responding to sustainability. Again, a very big thank you to all the panelists. The publications ITC is about to release will be at your disposal in the chat box. Umbrella, they have been already promoted. A few words more in a few minutes, but in the meantime, again, a big thank you to our panelists and looking forward to keeping in touch with all of you. Thank you so much. All the very best.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I already assessed 2 events of SheTrade MENA. It was a great opportunity for me to connect with the businesswomen and also inspire me to go ahead with my project. So, as we know, each successful story starts with the first step, and my first step was with SheTrade.
When I started the company back in 2004, I was only distributing to one retail customer. Today, we distribute to 75 retail locations throughout the GCC, as well as 13 online platforms. About a year ago, I was invited to join SheTrades. It has been a great platform for me. I've been able to connect with like-minded women who have gone through the same trials and tribulations as I have. I can share my experiences with them, and I can gain knowledge from what they have gone through.
Welcome back, everyone. You've just heard from 2 women entrepreneurs that we're working through the SheTrades Middle East and North Africa Hub. And we also do hope that you're continuing to network over the breaks. Remember, you can schedule virtual meetups, 15-minute slots with other participants and speakers during this summit until 8 p.m. Central European time today. So even after the summit ends, you still have a good 2 hours or so to meet up with different people. So we hope you take advantage of this. And before we went into break, my colleague Mathieu Lamole, who moderated the last session, promoted these new books that are available online now on the ITC website. That's intracen.org, intracen.org. One is on the State of Sustainable Markets 2020, Statistics and Emerging Trends. You can download this for free, as well as the Linking Voluntary Standards to Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, those are the United Nations Global Goals that's referring to. So both of these are available online on the ITC website to download for free. And now we are going to head into our second panel of the day. This one is on the digital transformation for shockproof and inclusive value chains. And I have the great pleasure of moderating this session with many forward speakers and forward lookers when it comes to how to use technology for green, sustainable, and inclusive trade. So this panel, I think it's quite fitting that we're following on the 3 before us. The first one, which talked about how the green transition post-pandemic is not only necessary, but that's profitable, and it can be profitable for both developing and developed countries. We also heard about why it's important to support women who are among the most affected by the pandemic, and we can support them through policies, social protection, education, access to education, and of course, digital tools. And just before, with our colleague Mathieu Lamole, we heard that there are many things that have to change. We need a systemic, rerun and reboot of how we do trade and how we think about trade and who profits from it. So underpinning all of these topics is really how we can make this happen for everybody, so it's equal for all. And for that, we look to technology. We can use technology for all different types of things to make trade possible. And that's what we're here to talk about today with our speakers. So if I can introduce our speakers, we're very excited to have a great crew, a great team on the ground today. First off, we have Mr. Jason Kelly, who is the General Manager of Blockchain Services at IBM. Jason leads IBM Global Blockchain Services, partnering with other organizations to unleash the business value of blockchain technologies and reinvented business processes. So in other words, it's about rethinking how we do business using innovation and technology. Jason is an entrepreneur and has led the IBM Global Business Services Solutions Design and Innovation Unit. Very exciting to have you today, Jason. We also have with us Ms. Emmanuel Gan, who's a senior analyst at the World Trade Organization, the WTO. Emmanuel works in the Economic Research and Statistics Division of the WTO, where she works on micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises and blockchain. And she also conducts research on these MSMEs. We'll refer to these small businesses as MSMEs. So their work in global value chains and advanced technologies. She has previously held several positions at the WTO, and she recently published a book called Can Blockchain Revolutionize International Trade? That's very fitting because that's what we're going to be looking at, hopefully answering today in this panel. And last but not least, we have Ms. Kaidi Rousselet, who's the CEO and founder of Funderbeam. So Funderbeam is the global funding and trading platform for private companies, which enables companies to raise funds and enables investors to invest with liquidity. So think of it in this way. Funderbeam is like NASDAQ, but it's global and it's for startups with investors from 132 countries. So Kaidi is a former CEO of NASDAQ Tallinn Stock Exchange and one of the central securities depository. And here's a fun fact. She's also the first IT lawyer in Estonia and is a co-author of the Estonian Digital Signature Act of 2000, which enables secure digital identities, which is all about creating trust, which I think is going to be a theme when we go into this. So thank you for all three of our wonderful panelists for joining us today. Hope you are well. Let's dive in to our first question. If we can go to Jason first, help us set the scene. Jason, you in the past have talked a lot about trade for good, whether that's in the context of Hurricane Harvey or forest fires in California. And of course, we can't ignore the big thing that we're facing right now, COVID-19. So how can blockchain and other disruptive technology help us respond to the COVID-19 pandemic? And actually, can you give us some examples how it's already happening?
It's great. And first, thanks for having me. And I'm very honored to be with such esteemed panelists with Katie and Emmanuel. So thanks for having me. And I think, as you said trade for good. And I think you're thinking maybe tech for good and tech which drives trade for good, in fact. And to set the stage, as you said, there's been a lot of discussion about what tech for good means and the thought of addressing it today around the SDGs. And when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, underlying all that is data, because we have to keep score. How do we know if we're reaching them? How do we know if we're going to reach the goal if we're not monitoring that data? And there has to be some sense of trust in that data. So we'll start with that, because just talking tech for tech's sake is like a sandwich, looking for a picnic. We're not just throwing it at a challenge. So it's in fact that data is at the base of this. And then also somewhere in there, it's how we use this technology and how we put it into action. You think of AI, and more than 8 years ago, as we published some principles around AI, which then was artificial intelligence, and now we call it augmented intelligence, because at the heart of that is humans. And so how as humans do we employ that? No difference. And we look at right now in the challenges we're having in the US, we have brought to light systemic racism and the challenges around that. We as a company, our CEO said, wait a second, let's stop facial recognition, selling facial recognition software, because it could potentially be used against people in the wrong way. So ultimately it's a human decision. So now to get to the question that you ask, tech for good, with good tech. So if we're in charge, what should we be doing? Well, right now, there's a lot that we know we have to do in the current pandemic. And we think of this value chain, and I love that it's called that, because typically people think of a supply chain and they think of something going from point A to Z, and there's lots of handshakes along that way. Blockchain, without describing what it is, all it does is opens up that data so that those handshakes can be seen with trust and transparency. And if we can get rid of the handshakes, the people who are in the middle of that value chain that are just making those handshakes between A and Z, now we return value back to that supply chain. So this is that thought, how do we get trust and transparency from A to Z? So current state, think of that value chain as the old school supply chain I mentioned. What we've seen with this supply chain is that ultimately it's the consumer, all of us at the end of that supply chain benefiting. And we are the ones that want that trust and that transparency. And in the current environment, we've realized that that value chain is very brittle. It breaks very easily. Not only that, but we can only see maybe one level up or maybe one level down. Really siloing people into, and businesses, large and small, into their little place to play, their one little lane. So what did we see in the pandemic? We said, wait a second, we need a little bit more flexibility. For example, first it was personal protective equipment, PPE. Then it came down to just hand sanitizer. And then it was equipment such as ventilators and where we get them from. And now we're talking about vaccines. What happened in that dynamic relationship was all of a sudden we had car manufacturers making ventilators. We had designer clothes makers making PPE. And this supply chain that we thought we had before was now different because we weren't the typical buyer and supplier. And in fact, as we've all seen now, there were buyers that flipped to suppliers. For example, the small brewery that was once doing wonderful craft beer was making hand sanitizer and making a lot of it, and then shipping that to a hospital that needed it. And then the hospital said, wait a second, we overordered. Now we have storerooms of hand sanitizer. What are we going to do with that? Let's move it to another hospital. Let's sell this. Now they're now a supplier versus a buyer. Those relationships change. That's the dynamic. Well, how do we trust that hospital's that hospital and that hand sanitizer is really that hand sanitizer? How do we know that that brewery, who doesn't have the ecosystem to tie into the hospital, how do we make those quick connections with trust and transparency? Back to our data. If we could open up that data and make those handshakes without the brokers very quick and easily, we now come up with a very flexible supply chain. Not only that, but that craft brewer that was a small business who was threatened to go out of business is now back in business, better and bigger than ever, with a very hybrid type of model. So we think of now we have a hybrid platform, we have hybrid business model, hybrid roles in that. So this thought of adding that flexibility really changes this thought. So as you mentioned, you pick the challenge. Current is the pandemic, but it could be forest fires in the US and North America and California. It could be hurricanes. There's always a value chain of getting goods and services from point A to point B. And if we can pull down that veil of handshakes and open it up to trust, that allows us to use tech for good. And the other part of this pandemic that has come to light is that we go, wait a second, with so many people unemployed and so many people needing to get back into the workforce, we have now shown a light on what was somewhat shadowed, that, wait a minute, there's probably more opportunity for new types of jobs than people who are ready to fill them. We can't wait 4 years for people to go get new degrees. We can't wait all that time for a full training session to go through. Why can't we digitize those credentials? Why not? So this thought of putting credentials with trust and transparency on a blockchain opens up many, many markets for people to say, wait a second, if I just need to get a 2-year degree or certifications to put me to work right now, can I do that? Can I have a trusted source of certification and skills? Because that's the other part of this, just skills. I don't need the diploma, I need the skills to put me back to work. So with a credentialing network that we now have that capability to allow people to get back to work with the credentials they need that validate that their skills are ready to put to work. So there's a couple concrete examples of something we have. Rapid Supplier Connect was the name of the dynamic supply chain to allow people to make those handshakes. And then Learning Credential Network is one that allows people to validate and verify their qualifications and skills to get back to work. Couple examples, that's tech for good to get good results.
That was fantastic, Jason. This idea of making transparent these handshakes that are happening, these deals, these business deals, to even allow, breweries to become connected to hospitals. I don't think that was an example that we were expecting, but that's really cool. And also to hear that even when it comes to education and skills building, blockchain or other technologies can actually help people find skilling up better and also getting new jobs more quickly and more efficiently. So that's really great to hear. Next, if we can head over to Emmanuel. We've heard just from Jason right now how this can work for all types of businesses, but when we specifically focus on micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, and especially those in developing countries, how can they access these technologies? Because they sound really cool, but to make it actually practical for those people on the ground and maybe who don't have the means to do this. Can you speak on this?
Sure, thanks. And thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this event. May I take a few minutes to add to what Jason was saying before I come back to your question? Yeah, okay, thanks.
Great.
I just wanted to come back to a point that Jason made that I think is very important, is the question of agility of supply chains. The current pandemic has shown that there are indeed a number of supply chain inefficiencies in the system, and that supply chains, value chains are not flexible enough. And he's given a very interesting example indeed of IBM, the Rapid Supplier Connect. There are some other examples out there as well of decentralized marketplaces to bring buyers and suppliers together, like Timless, for example, which partnered with the Dutch government to map and analyze the medical supply chain and connect buyers and sellers. But I wanted to add one point, which I think is important also in the current context. I think the current pandemic has shown that tracking is vital. We've seen a number of counterfeit scandals that really highlighted the vulnerability of the medical supply chain and therefore the risk borne to by patients. So in March, for example, US authorities seized more than 80 million counterfeit and 40 masks. And this is where blockchain can play an interesting role because it allows for this track and trace. And there are a number of initiatives that exist to track the origin of products. I think what we saw during the pandemic really underscores the need for businesses and governments to improve the integrity and provenance of pharmaceutical products and medical supplies, of course, but also other goods. And this is somewhere where blockchain can be useful. And Swiss hospitals, for example, have devised a blockchain-based system to track the medical device routes, and so all transactions are tracked on the blockchain. So I just wanted to add that as an example because I think it's an important one. And the third point that I think that I wanted to flag in terms of the role of these technologies in the current context, and we've seen that clearly the pandemic has shown that going digital is a must. I mean, you have to go digital now. Trade digitalization has been lagging behind. Trade is still very labor, paper intensive. There are 4 billion documents generated as a result of trade activities. And part of the reasons, I mean, some of the reasons are linked to what Jason was saying, because you have many handshakes on the way. But another reason is that with current traditional technologies, if you can very easily copy documents. And some of the documents that you use in international trade, like the bill of lading, for example, are very important. Why? Because they are documents of title. They prove the ownership of goods. So you don't want this document to be copied. And what blockchain allows is to avoid this double spending problem because you know that the document that you will see on the blockchain will be the original. So, but back to your question on SMEs and the small producers and farmers and how they can make use of the opportunities of blockchain and of blockchain-based trade. I think one thing that is important to flag is that there is no need for them to know that they engage in blockchain-based trade. There is no need for them to be what we call a node. If they go to the bank to get trade finance and that bank has a trade finance platform that is powered by blockchain, the bank can be the node. All they need is actually a mobile, for example, or a computer with internet connection. And what they need to know are the opportunities that blockchain opens and the platforms that are out there and that offer interesting opportunities for them. And these opportunities are actually multifaceted. I think SME small producers can benefit a lot in terms of access to finance, in particular trade finance. Why? Because blockchain enhances transparency into the business operations. And one of the big problems of small producers is that they're not very good at signaling their fitness to be financed. Blockchain allows banks or other or investors to have greater visibility into the business operations and therefore to better assess their creditworthiness. So this can facilitate access of small producers to traditional trade finance, but it also opens interesting opportunities in terms of supply chain finance, and we've seen a number of initiatives emerge in that on that front, but also access to non-traditional finance or finance and trade finance. And you have some marketplaces that have been put in place that allow the small producers to build a credit history and therefore access finance through fintechs. Fast Track Trade is an example. You have another one in Russia, Karma, that allows users to invest in any SME. And so SMEs can access additional liquidity. Tokenization offers interesting opportunities. You have a project, for example, in Nigeria, where farmers can deposit their agricultural commodities in certified warehouses, and they get a token in exchange that they can use as a collateral to procure loans or other financial services. So there are multiple examples out there, multiple platforms and projects that have emerged. And I think one of the big challenges is how do we get the word out? How do these small producers and farmers know about these opportunities? And I think the real question is, how do we help them on that way? So in my view, there are two things that need to be done. First, a lot of awareness raising in terms of the opportunities that blockchain opens, education also in terms of IT skills. But second, we also need to make sure that we create an ecosystem that is, I would say, SME friendly. So what does it mean? It means making sure that the different platforms that exist talk to each other, because SMEs won't have the capacity to host 10 different nodes. I mean, it would make it very difficult for them to handle. So we need to work on standardization, for example, because lack of standards creates additional costs, especially for the smallest businesses and small producers. It's difficult for SMEs to meet various requirements and standards. So we need to work on that. And I think there's also some work that needs to be done to build a regulatory environment that really supports the development of the technology and that can allow these small companies, small producers to benefit from the technology.
Fantastic. It's about that building that trust again. So whether it's, farmers using tokens at warehouses, they don't need to understand blockchain or technology. But
no, they don't, indeed.
Opportunities. That's
indeed
a really point. Thank you very much for that. That
just
makes sense.
Yeah, just like you don't need to understand how the internet works, what HTML or XML is, what you need to do is actually access the internet, know how to use it. And it's the same with blockchain. I don't think that SMEs will build blockchain platforms, but they will be users of blockchain platforms. So what we need to do is make sure that we build platforms that are SME friendly, that address the needs and challenges of SMEs.
Great, easy to use, and they know about it so they can use it. Fantastic. And now we head to Heidi for a question. This concept of using technology to make things more visible, to make transactions or ownership deeds more visible, and making sure when money is sent over to buy something that it actually goes to the other end. All of these ideas are linking back to building trust and transparency in the system. And so Funderbeam actually provides startups with access to investment through a new kind of business model that enables access to capital and trading across the world. So you built your platform based on this idea. Can you explain how this funding process actually works and how innovators can attract investment and see if this is something that other people and other companies can also try to follow?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, and also very honored to be here and share the panel with such amazing co-panelists. And taking over from this handshake and getting to your question is what Funderbeam is doing. We kind of build the new age stock exchange. And those who know what the stock exchange is, and I wrote down a wonderful word, handshakes. Stock exchange system is full of handshakes. It's maybe one of the most handshake heavy business and value chain what we have. Brokers and banks and clearing and settlement and central securities and central banks and everybody and all those entities, what they do, they are the links in the handshake chain, and they all provide trust. And if you think about going back to the history where stock exchanges started, it actually started from those East Indian companies. And the first stock exchanges were coffee shops in the ports where somebody was selling the shares of or access to investments to the East Indian companies, and the buyers were on the same coffee shop. And for me, it seems that the blockchain is the new age coffee shop. It eliminates the need for those additional handshakes that due to those centuries and system getting so much more complicated. We're getting back to the coffee shop time, and the technology is actually doing the work of the handshake. And this is exactly the card what Funderbeam is playing, is that there's the company who needs the money, an investor who wants to give the money. And there doesn't need to be millions of intermediaries between, but only a platform and the technology in between, so that the investor can trust the company and company can trust the investors. And when the investors trade among each other, there's again has to be the trust. I know that the other party is the party that it says to he or she is. And the way companies can access funding and even SMEs, not only startup on the marketplace, is obviously the marketplaces like us. We have to do the due diligence. We have to be this trust provider that the company exists, that the business model is validated. But once it's on the platform, it's viral, it's there, it has the trust stamp, and we have to provide these quality investments for the investors. And it was so nicely said that SMEs, they don't need to understand the technology, and also our users don't need to understand technology. But what they need is a solid applications and trustworthy applications. And also we talk a lot about the blockchain. Blockchain itself is not the solution to the problem, but those smartly built applications that use the power of the blockchain. To add what was mentioned just previously in both of the talks, is that the blockchain as a technology is in a way like a different internet protocols as a technology. It can be connected. So the several applications, thanks to the technology, can be connected, meaning that the SMEs may access one application or one service, but with this be connected to so many other services the SME needs.
Great. So it's kind of innovating with the technologies that exist, including blockchain and other new ways of doing business, to make sure that the solution fits the needs.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That actually leads us perfectly back to Jason, this idea of kind of doing things differently and using technology to actually achieve goals. Because as Kaidi said, blockchain isn't the goal itself. It's how you use it that really makes the difference. So can you tell us, COVID-19 has really changed the way we do things, the way we work. People are working more remotely. People maybe not going into the office as much anymore. Things are different. So can you share how tech can be used to make businesses more sustainable and environmentally friendly, whether it's working from home or in the office?
As I hear that question, it really brings us to mind what we're doing right now. We're not standing on a stage.
Right.
We're not somewhere in one of our countries, having spent time to get to the hotel. We're doing this remotely. Yeah. So we're all doing this and engaging in a new way. So it's easy to say that we all experience, because we start to think about the sustainability and a carbon footprint. And we start thinking about the ways that we are working differently. Now, we as a technology services company, and even more recently announced AI cloud company, this is our second nature. And on day 2 of everyone staying at home, we had 95% of our workforce at home working. And then a week following, we had 98% of our workforce in India, which typically goes into the office. We had them at home working. And that takes a lot of things to move around, technology, enablement. Mm-hmm. And that becomes the given. And we start thinking, okay, well, that's nice, but what else? All of us are now using many more electronic devices. I have to charge my phone twice as much as I used to. What's behind that? Start to think about where we're going with regards to sustainability and what's required to make sustainability sustainable. Back to my data. What do I mean by this? And hopefully I'm not talking in puzzles here. Is that in fact, let's use the example of the batteries. Primary component of a battery is cobalt. Cobalt sourced around the world and is often a conflict mineral. Well, just saying that we're going to make sure that this cobalt was responsibly sourced, we know is tough because other sources of cobalt can find itself into a shipment. Well, real time, we pulled together with a number of automobile manufacturers, as well as miners, as well as shipping agents, to say, let's put together a responsible sourcing blockchain network, shortly in the initial RSBN. And soon there were many manufacturers of those products, as well as the minds that said, this makes sense. Now we can have access to the data as a shared capability, as well as, just as when you hear these things about validation and verification, that documentation that a property is a property, a person is a person. In this case, that mineral is that mineral that went from point A to point B with trust and transparency. And there's not as many handshakes needed. And those that are ones that can be seen with real trust. And that puts up new definitions of this value chain and players in it. For example, we think, oh, well, what happens to the regulator? Well, guess what? The regulator becomes an observer. The regulator becomes a participant. Just as was mentioned, I believe by Manuel, this thought of do you need a node? Well, no, you don't have to have your own. You could participate and have permissioned access only to what you need to see. The source of the cobalt or handshake between a shipper and a receiver. That's it. That's how the technology is opening up new capabilities. And in context of the current pandemic, replace cobalt with vaccine. And you start to go, oh yeah, it's the same. Forget that it's a different industry. Forget that it's a different value chain. In fact, it is the same type of situation, just a switched service or product. And whilst it may seem distinctly different, the same airplanes or ships that may be moving that vaccine, tomorrow could be the same planes and ships moving the cobalt or that same ecosystem. And so a necessity that I'll highlight that was brought out, I think by Manuel as well, is that in fact, it's truly a network of networks. And if I'm shipping with batteries in this boat today and then vaccines tomorrow, it's really a network of networks that must come together. So they have to be able to work and communicate.
Great. Can we ask you about one thing, Jason, that you mentioned? You said how to make sustainability sustainable. That kind of was in my mind. And you talked about if people are using batteries more and you're charging your phone twice as often, can blockchain and these types of technologies, or not even blockchain, but just technology in general, look at what we're doing and adapt that so whatever we are doing actually is documented, we have data behind it, and we kind of pivot to match this?
You nailed it. That's exactly it. And that's what is meant by keep making sustainability sustainable. It's not a new word. We've been talking about it for years. We know what it means, but how do we keep score? How do we make sure that what we're saying is sustainable truly is? And it's that transparency in what we all talk about. The other wonderful buzzword is the circular economy. Do we know that in our Farmer Connect capability that we have, I'll keep dropping out these buzzwords, a Farmer Connect, and using Kaidi's example, love the coffee example, Kaidi, because Farmer Connect is something we've done with coffee farmers to bring that bean all the way to your barista. And you can even, with an app, tip your farmer so that you said, okay, thank you. Instead of tipping the barista, you can tip the farmer. Well, that sounds novel, but the key point is that you now have a full cycle of visibility so you know that you're truly sustainable. And we're not doing the typical thing that we all know is while we all raise our hands and say, man, I love organic food and I eat it. We also know that there's more organic food eaten and consumed than is produced. So somewhere in there, there's a lack of transparency. So let's make sustainability sustainable with trust and transparency using blockchain.
Thank you. That's great, Jason. The sustainability side, and of course, the other side of it is also inclusivity. So Emmanuel, can you talk to us about how women in developed countries who run small and big businesses, how can women become more involved in this? And is there a way they can also make money and have it still be sustainable and good for the environment and still provide for their families?
Sure. I mean, we talked about SMEs a little bit earlier. I mean, many small businesses are actually women owned. So we talk a bit about the same thing. I mentioned that access to finance was one area where blockchain can make, in my view, a big difference. When it comes to women specifically, there are some interesting projects that have been developed to help women specifically. I have in mind one, which is called BP Cash, for example, which is a fintech startup that uses blockchain technology to enable secure money transfer among women so that they can have access and control over their own money, independent of the male members of their family. So this is one concrete example of a project that uses blockchain to empower women. Blockchain is a technology that can allow them to, here again, build their own financial history. So I referred a bit earlier to the credit history of companies. This is something that can be very powerful for women to help them access finance. It can also be interesting for them to create their own identity and for ownership of documents. And we all know that there are many people, unfortunately, still without a clear identity. Many of them are women, and this is one area where blockchain can help. You have this concept of self-sovereign identity. So this is a technology that can help just a few words on SMEs and especially women, and so can help promote inclusion. But at the same time, I think it's important to note that and you can't expect too much from blockchain. It's not a magic wand either. It's not a panacea. It's not going to resolve all problems. And as Katie was saying, it should not be the goal. It's the way you use it. So it's a technology that offers interesting features, and it's up to us to use it in a way that makes trade more inclusive and that allows SMEs and women to really benefit from the opportunities that the technology opens.
Great. Again, it's kind of building the networks of the networks and making sure that the right people are having access to it. And if you mentioned access to finance, which is, I think, across the board for women and men who run businesses, one of the biggest challenges that they face. Would that be correct?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Then to Kaidi, this idea of using technology wherever you're based to actually do more business and have more transparency is amazing. And we've heard examples of how this is working. And you've actually shared before that entrepreneurs, it doesn't matter where you're born, what your gender is, what your culture or religion you affiliate with. At the same time, though, what we've been hearing is for smaller businesses or women-led businesses, they're a bit more vulnerable during times like this when everything's kind of thrown into the open and we see that the value chains are brittle and not as flexible. So do you have ideas on how we can address this using technology?
Sorry, I'll unmute. Yes, it is indeed a problem, and it goes all around the world. I remember because I'm Estonian, right? And we gained independence in 1991. And I remember how difficult it was for the first enterprises to be set. And before, we didn't have a very strong, our own super founders who funded the startup businesses back in early 2010s. So many Estonian companies and Estonian funded companies had to go outside the country to get the access to the capital. This means that so many companies are, because of capital, incorporated outside the countries, outside the original countries. And you know how it goes. Then the team is following the capital, the headquarters is following the capital, the taxes are following the capital, and the cycle starts. So the access to capital and due to those marketplaces and online marketplaces, this is the first thing that we can do as an entrepreneurs and as an organizations to really provide online access to the capital, enable local investors, but also the global minded, but maybe philanthropic investors to invest in local businesses. When I think about the developments overall that brought to us by the technology and now getting back to the blockchain technology, then imagine a piece of company as a piece of cake, and it's called equity. Investors get the piece of cake, and equity. And it's all, the cake is yellow or brown when it's chocolate cake. But what the blockchain introduced, it introduced the layers in the cake, because investors could invest in the project, in the technology, in the protocol, in the sustainability, in the revenue. So thanks to the technology, the founders and the entrepreneurs, they have so many more choices, and they have so many more freedom to tailor the need for the capital. And it doesn't need to be only the cake named equity. You get all in. But sometimes fund a piece of technology, or sometimes when we talk about the cleaning up the ocean, then the investors, what they do care, they care about the clean ocean. They don't care about the equity. And Emmanuel just mentioned V2 cash. So these kind of developments, what we see coming to the world and being accessible, no matter where the entrepreneurs are, because majority of the solutions are global and accessible to entrepreneurs all around the world, or I must say, to those who have access to the internet. And here is where we become dependent a bit about this infrastructure companies.
We love this idea. We first mentioned the coffee shops as the kind of original stock exchange, and now this idea of like equity as a cake. And now instead of just seeing one flavor, you can see the different layers, which actually, if I want to just invest in even 1% of a country, I can still see 100% of the transactions, or how the business functions in that. Is that an accurate?
Yeah, yes, it is. It is in a way, and again, when we talk about the blockchain, then what the blockchain as a technology does, it controls the assets that is issued, and it controls the use of the funds, and it controls also the outcome of it.
Great. Again, about how to use the technology.
Yes.
So fantastic. Now we do have several questions from our viewers right now. So if we can start to take the viewer questions, that would be great. If you'd like to answer, please just kind of give me a wave, and we can do this. So the first one is, it's a very relevant one. Even though tracking has helped governments fight the pandemic, can we protect privacy at the same time? And this is something that all three of you have brought up in some way or another when it comes to trust, transparency, and now there's this privacy element. So who would like to tackle this one?
So I'll start out if I can, and the thought that something that we've maintained, and the beauty of blockchain is that we allow those that create the data to own the data. That data are those. So if we tend to think of privacy and the fact that we're bringing up healthcare, is that my data about my health is my data, and blockchain does allow a permissioned view of that data, and that I can control that. And it's certain. So as we have developed now a very interactive capability, once you have been tested, and if you're COVID negative positive, there's something called Health Pass. Health Pass app sits on your phone. You're able to say, I'm COVID negative. And that's all you want to share. You didn't have to find out anything. Where I live, if I had a piece of cake and a cup of coffee this morning, I do have to say that because, Kaidi, I'm now craving chocolate cake and coffee. So thank you for that. But all you need to know is, am I negative or positive? And that's it. And the only entity I want to know that is the one that I've permissioned to use it. There's no reason to spread it anyplace else. And I can then control my permissions, and I can control my data with certainty, trust, and transparency. And that's very key. So a great question, because again, forget the B word, put it way behind us, and just say, can we do that now with the current capability that we have? And the answer is yes. And that's why it's taken, I think, such a tragic happening to bring out some of the positives that we have in the current capability.
Great. Emmanuel, you have thought? Oh, Kaidi, please go ahead.
I can add from Estonian side, because as you know, Estonia is one of the most countries in the world, and in Estonia really everything is online. We have health records online, we have businesses online, we have all the population data online. And for example, the way and the data is mainly owned by people or the company. So my data, my health data is owned by me. And when I go to the doctors, then my health story and my health records travel with me. So I give permission to the doctor to get access to the data. And we had several cases in Estonia where the health records were accessed by the doctors who did not have the permission to get access. And the consequences were rather tough. When I check my records in some of the let's say a traffic registry, then I see the date and the time when police has been checking my data. And it's mostly because I was sometimes driving in the city and they just check the cars around them to see if the documents of the cars are fine and the driving license and these kind of things. So it's fully transparent. And the thing is, there's a very fine balance and very maybe light balance between protecting the privacy and misusing the trust of the citizens and of the users. But I love the word transparency. It's okay if the state is using my data, but I as a citizen have to understand the reason for it. And this is, I'm proud actually that Estonia has been able to build. I can check who has accessed my data, and I can also give access to my data. And everything, by the way, is thanks to the technology, because you can imagine if my health record would be on paper, I could never track who has accessed my health records.
Right, that idea of not only myself sharing my data, but knowing who looked at my data, that's real transparency. And I do want to mention again that Heidi was the co-author of the Estonian Digital Signatures Act of 2000, which enables secure digital identities. So this is definitely something in line with what you're talking about. I do want to hear from Emmanuel though, because for small businesses in particular, if I am a farmer in a remote part of a developing country, I am not aware if my documents or my privacy is being used in a different way. Do you have ideas on this? Would you like to comment on that?
Well, I think Jason and Katie summarized very well the situation. Basically, with blockchain, the beauty of blockchain is that you have control over your data, which is not the case in current systems. I mean, if you put information on social media right now, everyone basically your identity is being used by those entities, be it Facebook, Amazon, etc., and they control your data. With blockchain, you control your data, and you can decide who has access. Of course, it depends on how the platform has been designed, who has rights to it, to read, write, etc. Not all platforms have exactly the same design, but one. So to summarize, you have access, you control your data, and two, you control who has access to your data as part of the design of the blockchain platform. And I think this is something that should be extremely reassuring for small businesses who right now have no idea, and even not only small businesses, no one right now has no idea how our data are being used. And they are being used by many companies, big companies around the world. With blockchain, this is much more difficult. So this trust, this reassurance should be something to keep in mind for those small businesses.
You touch upon a really good point. Depending on the platform, the rules can be different. So for small businesses, it's extra important to make sure when you are signing up to use a platform to know how your data will be used. And if you're okay with that, then you sign up. So thank you for that. We head to another question. We can observe that innovations like traceability are driven by large corporations and often imposed on the small businesses or suppliers. Is this the only way forward? And I think this is talking about maybe some standards when it comes to making food products. Suppliers have to meet certain standards in order to get into a certain market. A lot of this is driven maybe by the bigger corporations. Is this the only way forward, or is there another way? Would anyone like to comment on this one first?
Maybe I can jump in here. I mean, it's true that there are a number of projects that are driven by big corporations, very interesting projects that do offer very interesting opportunities to smaller businesses. This being said, you also have many of these projects being driven by startups, so small tech companies that come up with an idea. When you talk about track and trace, one of the first startups in that area that developed projects using blockchain is Provenance, that is based in the UK. And they carried out a number of projects that are very interesting to improve the traceability along the supply chain and empower those small farmers to negotiate fair prices for mangoes, for example, or to prove that the fish that have been caught have been sustainably caught. We were talking about sustainability just a few minutes ago, and was labor-free. So you do have a whole ecosystem. It's not only the big companies. You do have a number of small tech companies that are jumping onto the opportunities that blockchain opens to develop products and try to solve a number of issues related to international trade, related to sustainability, and other issues. I think what is important there is the role that governments can play. I think governments have an important role to play to support the development of this technology, to support innovation. Technology, after all, is only a tool, and you need to nurture that technology in order for it to really have a transformative impact. And we've seen a number of governments being very active in that area. There are a number of them that have put in place, for example, sandboxes, both in developed and developing countries, like Rwanda, Kenya, and others have put in place sandboxes to promote innovation. And I think this is something that is critical. There's a big role of governments, and I believe of organizations like the ITC, or the WTO. I mean, the ITC, you work with SMEs, and I think it's important also for you to support the small businesses, explain to them the opportunities and support the development of the technology and help them benefit truly from the technology. So that public dimension, in my view, is very important. And when it comes to blockchain, I think we really need to work in tandem, the private and the public sector together. And you talk about standards. Yes, standardization is important in my view. I mentioned it can create barriers to small businesses. What we see in international trade is indeed, if we want to build synergies between the different platforms and truly remove frictions from international trade, we will need to develop some standards. And it's probably the best approach would be a public-private cooperation on that, instead of letting a big corporation develop their own standards. So what do we need? We need data models for the different trade documents, so that the data is entered in a standard way. It does not have to be entered at 20 different times in 20 different ways, for example. And this is where I believe international organizations and governments have a key role to play.
Thank you for mentioning that, because that's we haven't talked about the role of governments in creating this right ecosystem for that. I don't know if Heidi also wants to talk about this flattening of people who are in this field, where your platform actually does not need to have people who are regulating, because it almost self-regulates. You don't have these top-down approaches. Did you want to comment on that, or we can go to the next question if not?
Yeah, the governments and regulation, I very much like Jason was talking about the regulators, and I think the new age regulators, they need to have very different skills. So it's not about, knocking on the doors and entering the office. It's about understanding the code and understanding how the technology is built and how the platform is built, and how the functions there on the back office. But what I understand also, because Fundabeam is regulated in UK, so we've been working with UK regulator. We are regulated, our stock exchange is regulated in Singapore. We've been working with the Singaporean regulator. Now, because of Brexit, we are working back with Estonian regulator. And I must admit that governments are very forward-looking. they are working on their own fields, and I can talk about financial sector. But with the financial sector, it is exactly like we discussed. How do we get access to the capital? How do we get access to capital online? How do we work with digital banks? What are the risks with digital banks, and what do we as regulators, when they explained us, need to see around those digital banks? But there has been no discussions with us whatsoever, is that, we don't think things should be done like that. I think the customers should go to the banks. And again, the other thing, what I told also to Estonian regulator closer to my home, is that nowadays the competition is not only between companies, it's between the regulations. Because the entrepreneurs and SMEs, and especially when we can serve online, we don't change our business models because of the regulation. We move the businesses to the regulations which supports our business model. And that's a huge opportunity, but it's a huge challenge to those countries and regulators which are sort of too conservative on the future markets. So the challenge is for the governments and for the regulators, and either they look forward or they try to protect the status quo.
I feel like the status quo is no longer an option. Jason, I don't know if you want to comment on this dynamic between government and business kind of working together. As a multinational, you definitely have influence in this area, and especially when it comes to using technology to keep pace.
I think Katie brings up a great point, and we think about this international global value chain that's so transparent now. It's the Friedman, the world is flat kind of moment where you're like, okay, yeah, it is. It truly is. And not only that, but now we know that this value chain is truly a team sport. And as it's powered by blockchain capabilities, using the B word again, is that it is a team sport, and we see roles changing. Where I want to move to Estonia because, as in 1991, they said we're going to be digital first. We're going to figure out, and we just heard this wonderful what Kaidi said. If you were to say, we're going to allow you to see when I access your police records, or the police has access your personal. There's countries where heads would explode if you said that. It's not because of the technology, and that's what's key here. It's the process behind that, the business process. I love it with this thought of the status quo. Even using it, makes me feel like I go gray. You couldn't see it if I did because there's no hair there. But in fact, it's like that's so heavy when you hear it. Instead, what we need to think about is what is the outcome that we're trying to get here, and that outcome is driven by trust, and it's going to cause different models, different levels of trust. We do it personally and as consumers, and this is where this has to go. When you think of private-public partnership, what I described earlier with regards to the current pandemic, think about it. You have vaccines from some manufacturer that's highly regulated through test and safety and so forth, and it's going from that manufacturer in a very, very regulated permission and maybe not so transparent, but someone is looking at all those handshakes as it goes through shipping ultimately to a consumer. And it goes through, so you have manufacturing, which is pharma, you have travel and transportation that's getting it there, you have government and regulatory, and then you have back to medical or to the medical facility that's distributing it, and maybe even through consumer/retail as it may be distributed through a pharmacy. I just walk through all those industries, and all those industries have their own regulatory bodies, all their own way of working with data. I can go down that list. So it's not the technology that's having challenges, it's how do you break down all of those walls so that now there's just one big handshake. And that is the effort that then leads me back to beautiful Estonia, is that's where they started. That's where Kai's team has said, listen, let's just figure out the outcome. Who needs to shake which hand? Let's get that done. And everyone else can be an observer to make sure that the handshake happened at that time, by whom and for what reason. it becomes that simple, but it's that simplicity that's causing the complexity in execution.
It's the one big handshake instead of the many. I think you mentioned at the beginning, Jason, it was no longer artificial intelligence, but is it augmented intelligence, where it's a human mind that's structuring how to use the technology and the blockchain?
Exactly. It's also the human mind that sometimes is the hardest part to get around the easy outcome.
Sure, that's a different topic, but yes, agreed. Great.
Yeah, if I may just jump in here, I mean, it was a very, very interesting example, the example of Estonia. And I mean, Estonia is clearly one of the leading governments in that area. What I think we need is not only one single handshake at the national level, but ideally, we would need to move towards a one single handshake at the global level if we talk about international trade. One of the challenges that I see right now is a risk of regulatory fragmentation. You have some governments really actively looking into blockchain and trying to see how indeed they can support the development of the technology, but they're all doing it their own way. And we have no real dialogue on how can we do it at a global level in order to all go into the same direction. Blockchain is a global technology. It's a technology that can break silos, that can break those walls that Jason just mentioned. And it's a great start to do it at a national level, but I think we need to go one step further if we really want this technology to have a truly transformative impact on the economy as a whole and on international trade in particular. We need to break these walls beyond the national borders. And this is where I believe international organizations have a critical role to play to try and pull all these strings together.
Yes.
That's very good. Global handshake.
Yeah, and that also adding from my side is that our generation is in a way this transformative generation, because we make the decisions what the world is going to be providing for the generation like our children. And they are sort of a bit very different, because yesterday I told my 9-year-old son to set, because he had to be on time somewhere, and I said, set the timer. And then he was shouting from one part of the house to the other, hey Siri, set me a timer in 15 minutes. and my thinking is that if we think about it, then our generation needs to make a decision for the services and for the life and for the society. This kind of Siri generation is going to use. And do we build them the better future really fully using the power of the technology? We kind of ask them to go and upstairs to find the clock and, set it in 15 minutes. And that's a responsibility.
That's a wonderful point. We have a responsibility and the opportunity to do this, that idea of tech for good that we heard. Thank you very much for that. To our next question, we have farmers do not need to understand blockchain. And I think that's something that Emmanuel has also made a point of. So what do you need from African SMEs, small businesses, to get this rolling? Like, how do they start on a practical level? Is this something that you'd like to tackle, Emmanuel?
Yeah, sure. And I think I touched upon it when I answered your question. Yes, you don't need to understand the technology, but you need to be aware of the opportunities. So I think there's a lot of work that should be done in terms of awareness raising. There's, of course, a need to also have digital access to the internet and good bandwidth. And here we go back to a point, which is that in Africa in particular, access to the internet remains very limited. And when there's access to the internet, the bandwidth also remains limited. So we do have a digital divide that it's still a reality. It's a problem if nothing is done in the years to come to address this digital gap and digital divide. We may see inequality that will continue to grow, and maybe a technology like blockchain that will in a way exacerbate this divide, because it may cut off those who do not have the technical capacity to participate in them. But we see a lot happening in Africa, and I mean, developing countries have shown that they can leapfrog. We saw it with M-Pesa. Now there's BitPesa. There are a number of initiatives out there, and I think it's more getting the word out what can you get from these different platforms? What are the platforms, the projects that exist? And this is where maybe there's a role for government to step in also to make known to those farmers what the opportunities are when it comes to blockchain.
Great. So the government have to give more awareness raising on this, and also maybe build the infrastructure needed to have mobile technology.
Oh, clearly, yes, yeah. I mean, the IT infrastructure is critical, especially in Africa. I mean, we need to really need to improve the IT infrastructure to allow the broad scale deployment of this technology on the African continent. But as I said, if you have a mobile with internet connection, you can access blockchain platforms. And then it's more a question of knowing the opportunities that exist.
That makes it easy for the small businesses. So thank you for reminding us of this. This is perhaps our last question before we kind of go into our wrap-up time. Any suggestions for how small businesses can prepare or act to benefit from the digitization of their business spaces? Is the investment in IT all that is needed? I think, Jason, at the beginning, you mentioned how IBM within, was it a week or a few days, almost 100% of your IBM staff were able to start remote working from home. Is this important and necessary and worth it for even the small businesses?
I'll go back to something I said earlier. I think that it's starting digital first. Think that way. Think about what you really need as a small business. Having been one myself as a startup, you do have, and I keep coming back to Katie's example of Estonia, and the thought of Emmanuel's being able to execute in a different mindset that isn't status quo. So if you bring those two things together, we think of a small business that thinks digital first. Of what applications do I need to have native? Probably not that many. That's why there's a cloud capability and even a hybrid cloud. And I'll save you the hybrid cloud sales pitch from IBM. What I'll tell you is that you have to be flexible on that infra side so that you can, in fact, quickly go digital and create new business models. And it may sound aspirational, but that is the opportunity that we have in front of us now, where you can quickly go from a small business to a very large business because you can transact at a much, much higher level and more broadly across the ecosystem. So when you think of small artisans, even, I thought of this as we were talking about farmers in Africa. A great startup in North America, California to be exact, a company called Inspired Lux, led by Denise Bradley Tyson, who's saying, look, why can't we make sure that the local artisan in Latin America or in Africa owns their design, that weave pattern that they just put together that's going into that cloth that then goes to some other distributor or may find its way to the shelf on your local retailer. Why don't they get paid? Well, this thought of inclusivity through transparency is what we have in front of us with regards to blockchain in that small business. So that access to the capability to do that online, digitally, and then starting with a digital footprint to begin with, this thought of how can I be more nimble with increased flexibility using the digital capabilities that I have that don't have to sit within my box, if I have a box at all. So that's the opportunity I think it's in front of us, is to start digital and go quickly.
Start digital and go quickly. We keep hearing Estonia. I feel like we have to go to Katie. Would you like to say something?
Yeah, I would actually add on the example from Singapore, because last 2 years I was living in Singapore, and during the lockdown my family was in Singapore. And it's an excellent example of a small bakery with a cafe, or actually cafe with a small bakery. And because of the lockdown, all the restaurants and bakeries, they were closed. And then this bakery decided that, hey, why don't we start introducing a monthly subscription for the breads and pastries we produce every single day? And it ended up people ordering monthly subscription bakery, meaning every single week we got freshly baked bread, croissants, cinnamon rolls left behind our doors. But again, going digital, you know, and it's not all about digital, it's actually innovating the business model, which kept them going, which helped them to keep the wonderful stuff, plus also manage the cash flow, which is difficult, especially in this bakery business. And for all the SMEs, I urge to really innovatively approach to your business model and see what can you do and how better you can manage the use of technology, but also add this nice nuance on the cash flow management.
And never underestimate how much people are willing to have fresh bread weekly or monthly.
Yes.
Heidi, there's a pattern. There's a pattern here. Chocolate cake, coffee, now croissant. And the sun is rising where I live, and as the sun's coming up, I'm going on mute because I think my stomach is going, feed me. Every time I'm going, Heidi, you're killing me here.
All of us, because we're thinking coffee, cake, and fresh baked goods and croissants. So all of us are kind of feeling this right now. So thank you very much. Emmanuel, did you want to comment? Otherwise, we'll head into kind of like our lightning conclusion round. You're okay. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Nothing to add.
Fantastic. That means Jason and Heidi have covered that well. So we've really covered a lot, from, transparency to building trust to making sure that the B word, as Jason said, blockchain is just an enabler. It is not the end goal. The networking of networks to make things happen using technologies together to create a streamlined, not repetitive kind of system. The idea of the one single handshake at the global level. There was a lot to chew on for us. Not real chewing, like Heidi was mentioning with the food, but a lot to do. So if you can, like in just a minute each, give us the one big takeaway that we should remember as we leave this panel. Who would like to start? Maybe we go in the order that we started in. Jason, would you like to give us the 1 minute key takeaway from this panel?
Yeah, I would. I'd start with not using the B word and saying that we don't walk around with a bucket of blockchain. So put the technology behind us and think about the outcomes first that we're driving for. And those outcomes that we've hit on are sustainability, making sustainability sustainable, and then also inclusivity. And both of those have a scorecard that are based on data, not just in keeping score on attaining those as outcomes, but also in the processes that get to those outcomes. So it all begins with trust and transparency to get clear outcomes. And that drives a very much more efficient and effective value chain, returning the value to the chain.
Great, thank you very much. Emmanuel, would you like to share your 1 minute big takeaway?
Sure. What I would say is that technology is only a tool, and if you really want to help SMEs reap the benefits of blockchain, we need to create the right ecosystem, an ecosystem that is SME friendly, and for this we need public-private cooperation.
Great, the famous PPP, public-private partnerships. Thank you, Heidi.
And I think following the same route, it is an attitude question, and it's an attitude question whether we see the technology as a risk or do we see the technology as an opportunity. And in case we see it as an opportunity, it opens so many doors and the ways how entrepreneurs, SMEs, businesses, governments can really benefit from the technology in the best way. So attitude and towards the technology as an opportunity.
Risk or opportunity, it is an opportunity, we're assuming. And before we close out, I think we should go back to the title of Emmanuel's book, which was the question that we wanted to ask. Can blockchain revolutionize international trade? Can you give us the 10-second version of this answer after this talk based on our conversations? I think we know the answer.
The potential is huge, but as I said, technology is only a tool, so we need more than just the technology.
Great.
So we need innovation, we need standardization, we need to build a proper environment to allow the technology to truly make a difference and hopefully revolutionize international trade.
Fantastic, that ecosystem. Well, thank you to you, Emmanuel, to Jason, to Heidi, for really a lot of brain food and a lot for us to chew on. That was really insightful and a great way to actually have this last panel, because it's looking forward, how we can use technology to build the right things. It is only an enabler of the bigger things that we're already trying to do in trade. So thank you to all three of you for your wonderful interventions. And we give thanks to our participants as well. We're going to go into a quick break, and then we will be back for a closing. But do stick around, because we have a special surprise when it comes to kind of wrapping up this event. So we'll see you back here in just a few minutes. Thank you. Thank you to the panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Welcome to SheTrades Outlook, the International Trade Center's new policy tool that makes trade possible for women entrepreneurs by improving the policy ecosystem. SheTrades Outlook is the first tool to cover both the trade and gender dimensions comparable across multiple countries. It can be used to highlight where countries are doing well, identify areas for inclusive policy reform, and share country experiences. The tool consists of 83 indicators over 6 pillars, including trade policy, legal and regulatory framework, business environment, access to skills, access to finance, and work in society. Each country has its own profile. For detailed country results, you can click on a particular pillar. SheTrades Outlook automatically allows you to compare results to other countries in the region. For more information on the variables and indicators, go to the qualitative data page. Using the scoreboard, you can also compare performance with other countries, sub-regions, regions, and economic groupings. Using the interactive panel control, select certain pillars and variables and even customize their weights. You can also download data for selected countries and share and embed the results on social media, other websites, and in emails. Good practices can be found on individual country profile pages or the Good Practices repository page. Here, you can search by country or topic and download a good practice brief for more information. To know more about the methodology or the institutions interviewed, please consult the Resources tab. You can access additional research and step-by-step guides on trade and gender through the publications page. To use the tool, visit shetrades.com/outlook.
Welcome back, everyone. What you just saw was a quick overview of our tool, SheTrades Outlook, which is the first of its kind that makes trade possible for more women by promoting a more inclusive policy ecosystem. Speaking of SheTrades, we have with us today Ms. Vanessa Arabogbo, who's the head of SheTrades here, and also the Chief of Sustainable and Inclusive Value Chains here at the International Trade Center. Welcome, Vanessa.
Thank you very much, Susanna. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, and good to see you.
Good to see you too, and good afternoon to all of you as well. Thank you so much for being with us for this last segue.
Yes, and it's good to see you again after you moderated that section with Mr. Bertrand Picard, who has traveled around the world in a solar powered plane. So that was very cool. Welcome back. And we also have a special surprise that we wanted to reveal to all of our participants today. Over the last 2 days, we've had a graphic artist who is actually a graphic recorder named Claudia Sinau, who has actually been taking notes visually over the last 2 days. So Claudia, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hi, Claudia. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to listen in and, just summarize all these important messages.
That's right. So you're going to give us a visual summary on one screen of all the conversations that have been happening over the past 2 days. I know you're still working on this, but how about we take a look at the progress so far, and we'll take a look and see what kind of notes have already started to come together.
Yes, so just bear with the technology a bit. It's loading.
Perfect.
There we go.
So on Claudia's iPad, she has been taking visual notes describing the biggest outcomes from all the events. And what Vanessa and I will do is kind of share them with our audience as a kind of a wrap-up statement. So maybe we can start on the first half of day one, if we can look at some of the big takeaways that were emerging from there. Thank you. So we see the title, Maintaining Momentum from COVID-19 Recovery to a Green Transition. So what sticks out to you, Vanessa?
You know, actually, what I want to do, Susanna, I was thinking, you know, before we started this session, about some of the things that really define the context within which we're having this Good Trade Summit. And I had 3 things that define the time that we're having this Good Trade Summit. Great. And I wondered if some of them might come up in the picture. And just to say, the 3 things were, the first one was the Sustainable Development Goals, and the fact that we were already lagging behind on the Sustainable Development Goals, which is why the Secretary General kicked off this decade of action earlier this year. The second one that happened just this week during this Good Trade Summit was good news. The WTO forecast for world merchandise trade was a decline of 9.2%. Wow. And that's good news because it's lower than the worst case scenario that they predicted earlier in the year. Bad news from WTO also was the decline in the 9.2%, because that means lower jobs and incomes as well. And then the third defining thing that was also happening this week was that the World Bank announced that it predicts a rise in extreme poverty for the first time in over 20 years. Wow. And cautions less inclusive growth and pressures of climate change, amongst other things, and urges, substantial policy action. So I'm wondering if we'll see anything here.
I think you did nod on it. Actually, the first thing that comes to mind is the interconnected, which we see kind of at the bottom above that big band that says emerging stronger from. What you're talking about, Vanessa, is this interconnectedness. When you say, merchandise trade has fallen, it's because all the supply chains and value chains are interconnected. And we see it says if it's not working for everybody, it's not working.
Absolutely. So the whole inclusive growth, and inclusive meaning inclusive of women, inclusive of poor people, inclusive, and that poverty being not just in least developed countries, but poverty rates also increasing in middle income countries.
Right. No one is free from this. It says also we will have to keep changing in the future. Yeah. It's this idea that if we are kind of staying the status quo, that's not good enough, and we have to keep adapting.
Yeah. And I think that also came up a bit in yesterday, this idea that we can't stay at a standstill, certainly in terms of climate change, the fact that, because of population growth, only even the rate of consumption of energy and resources is going to rise. So we have to find other ways to be more efficient and cleaner. Perfect. And so this whole keeping on changing into the future.
Exactly. And then this is a chance to invest in more sustainable value chains, which is what you're saying too.
Yeah.
And one of the speakers yesterday said something very interesting. Instead of build back better, it's build forward better. And that was kind of one of the key takeaways. We just can't do what we used to do. For this merchandise trade to go back up, for poverty to decline, we can't do what we are used to doing. And I think trade policy, it plays a big role in that. You'll see that kind of on the bottom corner there. It says trade policy to spur sustainability, but also inclusiveness.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And then international responsibility as well, I think is something that we've been hearing through the course of the year. Unless every country takes responsibility and works together, then no country progresses.
That's right.
So
that's very good. I think that was a great recap. Yeah, it's great to kind of look back and see what we've all talked about when it comes to the green transition. How about we now look at the second half of what we discussed yesterday, which is more focusing on the women and trade angle, because women are among the most impacted from COVID, which Vanessa knows very well. So the discussions here were, how can we support women so that they can adapt and become even stronger after this pandemic?
There was a McKinsey study put out recently that was talking about a $13 trillion addition to the global economy by 2030 if we take a progressive approach to, a progressive policy approach, including a gender inclusive progressive policy approach, as opposed to a regressive approach. So $13 trillion.
13 trillion.
Exactly. So this discussion was really important, and I hope that there was some solutions put out there.
Sure.
We can see community.
Yes.
Women are the cornerstone of every community.
That's correct. Yes.
And
please go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and that also came out, I think, in Her Excellency Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's comments talking about the experience of Ebola in Liberia as well, and the important role that women play in the community, and the need to have community engagement in dealing with an issue like the pandemic.
And it has to be tailored as well to different kind of environments. Yes. And maybe some of the main things that kind of came out of the discussions were for women, they need access to finance, which I think is across the board one of the biggest difficulties that people face, women and men. Also technology, access to technology, and then how to use the technology. It says skills and training in digital marketing and e-commerce, and also the social protection and safety nets for women. Those are that was like the trifecta: finance, technology, and social protection. Someone mentioned earlier today, 55% of people do not have social protection in the world.
That is,
yes, that could be higher for women.
Yes, it is.
Okay,
definitely. We know that it's higher for women. We know that they have less social protection. We know that they're in more vulnerable jobs. We know from our own ITC study, the SMECO report that was released in June, that they are more likely to work in sectors that have a greater affected by the pandemic.
Yeah.
So, I think we risk very much exacerbating existing inequalities. And as you said, this access of finance, addressing the needs of SMEs and women working in informal economy and self-employed women as well.
Right.
It's really important.
Right.
Public-private partnerships, one of my favorites, actually.
PPP.
Exactly. SDG 17 is one of my favorite goals.
Partnerships.
Yeah. Because I think that's when you really can start to see the impact.
Right. And it's about building the ecosystem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. You have to take a comprehensive approach. A bank cannot alone work on finance. It needs government involvement. Likewise, technology requires skills and training, but it also requires the infrastructure and the access to the tools. Prepare to pivot sooner than you think. I wonder, was that from the entrepreneur on the panel?
Yes, indeed. She was, I think, a Zambian entrepreneur who mentioned that. And she also said that as part of that, you need to have a business continuity plan. Because as a small business, that was one of the first challenges she faced during COVID. What do I do to tell my suppliers that I cannot meet not my suppliers, but the people that are buying my goods, I can't meet the deadline because I wasn't able to get my supplies to make the product.
Yeah.
I'm sure you hear these kinds of stories all the time.
In fact, and I hate to promote one of our services.
Please go ahead. We are ITC
at this juncture, but which is why we did exactly that. We developed a COVID crisis kit for SMEs and women business owners, and it basically has various different components, including cash flow management, risk forecasting, lots of different modules in it. And we've been delivering. It's been one of the most popular products of SheTrades this year, and it's being delivered by business support organizations. Actually, this week, I think 40 business support organizations were learning about the kit so that they can share it with SMEs in their network.
That's great, because we know business support organizations are kind of the multipliers who train the businesses to train others and all that.
Bingo, local capacity building.
There it is on the board, on the top left, building local capacity.
Yeah.
Great. And if somebody wanted to get involved, can they just go on the SheTrades website?
SheTrades.com.
And
look around for it, and they can look it up and download it and use it. It's part of our global public goods.
Okay.
This
is good. That goes back to the leaving no one behind. Women, men, SMEs, everybody. And that's kind of on the right-hand side. There is that umbrella with the rain coming down, which Claudia did a nice job of illustrating, to make sure that everybody kind of is covered. I guess this was the idea.
Yeah.
And then at the very bottom, it says, we can't let COVID win. I think that's...
We will not let COVID win.
Yeah.
Actually, I was very, listening to the conversations, I was really, really hopeful. you know, and I, you know, everywhere I go, I get a real sense of urgency and a real sense of hope and a real sense of, you know, it's like we've been woken up from sleepwalking into disaster. And one of the things I heard yesterday was that solutions exist. It's a matter of either commercializing them or you know, adopting them or implementing them, but solutions exist.
That's reassuring.
This is something I heard a lot.
Yes. And actually that brings us to something that we discussed today too. It was about political will being the main thing. Someone said it's not difficult. It's like what you're saying. The solutions exist. It is not difficult. It is the political will to make it happen. Yes. So maybe we can, at this point, Claudia, we can zoom out to see the right-hand side. And I will kind of, actually, we'll see if we can show this. Okay. So we're starting to see some of the things come together. So can we see some of the words? It looks like, maybe Claudia, you can help us and prompt us with some of these words. It says complete transformation. Is that correct? In the top right-hand corner?
Yes, so what we have is co-responsibility, and well, I'm still like in the process of compiling basically the key nuggets here, but like from the first panel that we heard today, we had a lot towards the collective effort and like being like distributing the prosperity to the stakeholders.
That's right. We actually heard the profits have to go to the stakeholders, not the shareholders. That actually came from our first panel today. And that was kind of a nice nuance.
Very nice. And actually, there were two things that I really liked about from the first panel today. One was, I always like to flip the challenge. So I was very happy to hear we need to stop asking how much it will cost to invest in more sustainable supply chains, but how much it will cost to not invest.
That's good. This is good.
You know, so it's really, what is the opportunity cost of not investing? And then the second one that I really liked, and something that I think we at ITC are very keen on, and it's central to our DNA, is someone said about including workers' voices to achieve shared prosperity. And again, it's that inclusiveness theme, because I always think that the more geographic diversity and just inclusiveness allows you to come up with the best solutions. And it gives you the closest sense of reality, so that you can design the solutions that fit.
That's good.
And I really like those two nuggets.
That's good. The diversity of voices to get the best solutions, which exist, the solutions that exist. Fantastic. And then our last panel today was about using technology. And one of the panelists who's from IBM was talking about blockchain, but then at one point he said the B word, because let's not focus on the technology. That's an enabler. The real thing is the process and how we use the technology to help women and the small businesses and all that. And they were also talking, they made many food references. So we all got hungry.
I was watching as well in my office, and I was just like, it's this panel about, you know, sustainable food systems or technology.
It was technology, but our colleague who was an Estonian expert in this area was mentioning that the original kind of stock exchange is like a coffee shop. And then she was using the fresh bread, and how during the pandemic, people were ordering fresh bread using an app. And that was a way to kind of stay resilient during the pandemic in Estonia. So it's really about using different types of technology to make things happen. And the big overall theme was the big handshake. So blockchain and technologies make visible all the little handshakes that happen, all the business deals, all the, you know, ownership documents that are passed, and all the payments that are made. So the big handshake, that was very visible.
That panel was very much about transparency,
100%,
traceability,
100%, trust,
trust
Yes.
aspect of technology.
That's correct.
And I think someone talked about, said, again, the whole solutions exist. As long as you have a mobile phone and the internet, you can access.
That's correct.
And it brought to mind, and I hate to be, the bringer of bad news, but it reminded me that, there's still 3 billion people who remain disconnected from the internet.
3 billion.
Yes, 3 billion people around the world. So as we, and it's a big concern because, not only for, technology, as we've seen in the pandemic, is going to proliferate through everything that we do, whether that's traceability and transparency or education or access to market, all of it. And so this is an area that I think since the drawing is still in process, I'm just going to throw out there, policymakers should really think about technology for all, access for all, internet for all. It's not a nice to have, it's a necessity.
That's good. That's actually another big key thing coming out of that last session was tech for good and how it's no longer an option, but we have to go in that direction. And it can be profitable, as someone said yesterday, a speaker said yesterday. It does, actually it was Bertrand Piccard. He said that it's not only the right thing to do, but it can be profitable, including for developing countries, which is key, because when we think technology, we think it's expensive and not doable.
But again, it reminds me of Africa, not much had been invested in the landline infrastructure. And so when mobile technologies started becoming available, the continent leapfrogged the landline network. And this is why it has such a high usage of mobile phones.
Like WhatsApp and all these other technologies to do business.
Yes, exactly. And even developed, locally developed solutions, mobile money.
M-Pesa.
M-Pesa. And these sorts of solutions.
That's very promising for developing countries, I think. They have a chance to kind of even get ahead of the developed countries, even in that sense. They could even compete.
Yeah, exactly. Compete on a more level playing field.
Perfect. Yeah. This is good. And actually, we can see that Claudia has been drawing based on the conversations. There is that famous big handshake that we're talking about. And I think we'll also see the policy side that Vanessa, you were just mentioning as well, how it's important to also make sure that we can have the right ecosystem in place based on all the players who are involved and also the policymakers.
And I think one thing that I've been thinking a lot about, and I've seen it, my eyesight is not so good.
It's okay, we can zoom in and out.
But, I think I've seen it in another quadrant, and I kind of see this proofing. So I see shockproof here in the digital quadrant.
That's right.
I think I've seen something about prediction and pivoting and so on. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is future proofing.
Yes.
And I think that's something implicitly in this picture comes up. We seem to have been caught by surprise by the pandemic, and yet we knew these things. Scientists predicted a lot of these things, and I think certainly from the trade perspective, we should be thinking about how we can future-proof trade and think about how things might unfold so that we can get even more buy-in. For the bouncing forward.
Better. That's a really good one. And actually about resilience in future shocks. That's perfect. And to wrap us up on just this part, there's one or two things in the middle circle. It says, as long as it's legal to pollute, we will not change. Those are strong words from our explorer Bertrand Piccard. It says also doing good means better business, which is true, which Vanessa, I know, agrees to this fully. The health crisis is not gender neutral. It affects women more. I guess this is what it is. And the last important statement was we need to define good trade as sustainable and inclusive.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Any last words, Vanessa, before we come into our closing? You agree?
Can I disagree? No.
No, you agree with this.
I agree with this.
Okay.
But really interesting. I think I think this is the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
yeah.
We're ending the summit, but it's just the beginning of how are we going to implement some of these ideas.
That's very good. And where do we go from
the
here?
Partnerships as well that we've been discussing on the platform and meeting people. Where do you go from here?
That's very good. Where do we go from here?
Yeah.
Looking forward.
Yeah.
We'll think about this. Yeah. Thank you so much, Vanessa, for joining us.
Thank you very much, Susanna. And don't forget to tell people to keep on networking. The
yes, we will.
Is open.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, because that's exactly what we're going to. So we wrapped up the visual summary of the event over the last 2 days. And actually, when this is finished and Claudia is finished doing that, we'll actually put it on our social media. So on Twitter, you can find us at ITC News, and we'll also put it on our website, Intracen, INTRACEN.org, so you can see the full picture. And actually, if you would like to follow Claudia on Twitter, her Twitter account is at @info_design. So thank you, everybody, for that. But remember, as Vanessa just said, the networking is still continuing. So until 8 p.m. today, Central European Time, which is about, I think, 2.5 hours from now, you can still continue to book these 15-minute networking slots with other speakers and participants who are part of this Umbrella platform. We know that already, I think it's the latest number we have is close to 1,200 participants and more than 20 participants over these last 2 days. And more than 2,800 meeting communications have happened. This number actually could be lesser than what we have, because I think we might have more updated numbers. If that's the case, we'll let you know on this. And so please do continue to book these meeting requests. Actually, we do have updated numbers. If I can just take a look right here, we have, yes, so close to 1,200 attendees over these last 2 days of the Good Trade Summit from 140 countries. Yesterday, we had participants from 80 countries. Now that is up to 140 countries. And with the networking, we have 3,500 meeting communications that were going on during these last 2 days. So this is fantastic. Thank you to everybody. You've also made #GoodTradeSummit trending yesterday. And we want you to keep networking for the next 2.5 hours, because the platform will be open. So on behalf of Vanessa, on behalf of all of us here at the International Trade Center, we give you thanks for joining us these last 2 days. And we do want to keep the conversation going online as well. Make lots of connections and happy networking. And thank you for joining us.